Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into The Potter Show, presenting to you today. What if Harry refused to board the Hogwarts Express and demanded Gringotts' investigation before attending school? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1. The boy who read the fine print. The scarlet engine was beautiful. Harry would give it that. Steam curled up from the Hogwarts Express in great rolling clouds, swallowing the legs of students and parents alike, and the platform hummed with the kind of noise that felt like it had been going on for 100 years and would keep going for 100 more. Trunks scraped against stone. Owls screamed. Somewhere near the front of the train, a pair of twins were launching what appeared to be a small explosive firework into a compartment window, while their mother shouted things that Harry suspected weren't entirely appropriate for a train station. He stood with his trolley at the edge of it all and watched. That was the thing about growing up in a house where you were never supposed to be seen or heard. You got very good at watching. You learned to read a room before you walked into it. You learned which floorboards creaked, and which cupboard doors swung silently, and what the particular set of Uncle Vernon's shoulders meant before he'd even opened his mouth. Survival had made Harry observant in ways that 11-year-old boys who'd had normal childhoods simply weren't. So he watched the Hogwarts Express, and he thought about what Hagrid had said. Someone tried to rob Gringotts. On Harry's birthday. The same vault Hagrid had emptied just hours before. Hagrid had said it like it was a footnote. Like it was a funny coincidence, a bit of exciting news to cap off a remarkable day. He'd said it while Harry was still reeling from the revelation that he was a wizard, that his parents hadn't died in a car crash, that there was an entire world folded inside this one that he'd never been allowed to see. Hagrid had said it and then moved on, and 11-year-old Harry, overwhelmed, stunned, trying to hold on to his own name, had filed it away without examining it. But the thing about splinters was that they worked their way deeper if you didn't deal with them. He'd had a month. 4 weeks of Dudley's snide comments, and Aunt Petunia's pinched silences, and Uncle Vernon's red face ranting about freaks and nonsense. 4 weeks of reading his textbooks under the covers with a torch, learning the names of things, learning the shape of a world he apparently belonged to. And in all that reading, in all those quiet hours, the splinter had kept working. Someone tried to rob Gringotts. The most secure bank in the wizarding world, according to his textbook. The vault they'd visited that morning, emptied by Hagrid on Dumbledore's orders. Harry looked at the train. He looked at Hedwig in her cage on his trolley, who looked back at him with large amber eyes that somehow managed to convey both affection and mild judgment. "I know," he said to her. "I know we're supposed to get on." Hedwig ruffled her feathers. "I'm not getting on." She made a small sound that was not, Harry thought, entirely disapproving. Hagrid found him 2 minutes later, which was impressive given the man's size and the density of the crowd. He came through the steam like a small mountain, his wild hair and beard already collecting moisture, his beetle-black eyes going wide when he spotted Harry still standing on the wrong side of the barrier with his trolley and his owl and his expression of quiet, immovable certainty. "Harry! Blimey, why haven't ye? The train leaves in 10 minutes, ye need ter. I'm not getting on the train, Hagrid." The giant man stopped. He looked at Harry the way people looked at things that didn't make sense, the way you looked at a chair sitting in the middle of the road, or rain falling upward. "What do you mean, you're not?" "I mean I'm not getting on." Harry turned to face him fully. He'd had a month to practice this conversation in his head, and he'd learned from the Dursleys that the best way to survive a confrontation was to know exactly what you wanted to say before the other person started talking. "Hagrid, when we were at Gringotts, you told me someone tried to break in. The same day we were there. The same vault you just emptied." "Well, yeah, it was in the Prophet, very exciting. You said it was a Class A non-tradable item. From Vault 713. Harry watched Hagrid's face do something complicated. "That's the vault you emptied for Dumbledore." "Not my vault. A different one entirely." "Harry, I can't talk about. I know you can't talk about that." "That's fine. I don't actually care about Vault 713 right now." Harry took a breath. "I care about Vault 687. My vault, Hagrid." The one with my family's money in it. He paused. How much money is in it? Hagrid blinked. How should I know? It's your vault. That's exactly my point. Harry kept his voice even. It's my vault. My family's vault. And I've never once had a single piece of parchment explaining what's in it, who manages it, where it came from, or why. If my parents were apparently wealthy enough that there's a whole vault in my name, I spent the last 10 years sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs. The platform noise kept going around them. A mother called for her son. The engine gave a long, low whistle. Hagrid's mouth opened. Closed. He looked, Harry thought, genuinely stricken, not the look of a man caught in a lie, but the look of a man who had simply never, in all the years in between, thought to ask. Harry. I'm not angry at you. Harry said, and he meant it. I don't think you knew. But someone should have thought about it, and no one did, and I'm not walking into that school until I understand what I actually own. He straightened his trolley. I'm going to Gringotts. You can't just, the train goes to Hogwarts. Hogwarts will still be there tomorrow, and the day after. My family's vault has been sitting there since 1981 and apparently no one's properly accounted for it in 10 years. Harry looked at Hagrid steadily. I'm going to Gringotts. You can come with me if you want, or you can get on the train, or you can write to Dumbledore. Those are your choices. But I'm not getting on that train today. There was a long pause. Hagrid looked at him. Really looked at him, the way no adult Harry had ever met looked at him, not like an inconvenience, not like a problem to be managed, but like he was seeing something unexpected and didn't quite know what to do with it. Your dad was like this, Hagrid said finally. When he'd made up his mind about something. Was that a good thing? Drove Dumbledore absolutely mad. A small smile moved through the beard. Also yes. Yeah, it was a good thing. The Hogwarts Express gave its final whistle. Steam billowed across the platform in a great white wave, and the scarlet engine began, slowly, to move. Harry watched it go without regret. Getting back through the barrier at King's Cross was easier than getting through had been. The magical sides simply released them as the platform emptied, and they came out into the mundane station with Harry's trolley rattling on the tile floor and Hedwig blinking at the fluorescent lights. Hagrid flagged down 3 taxis. It took 3 because Hagrid required approximately 2 of them by volume, and Harry's trunk required the 3rd. The drive to the Leaky Cauldron took 20 minutes through London traffic that made the cab driver mutter darkly about cyclists. Harry sat in the back of the first taxi with Hedwig's cage on the seat beside him and used the time to review, in his head, what he knew. The Potter Vault. He'd seen it, the mountains of gold, the silver, the stacked galleons catching the light from the goblins' lanterns. He'd taken a handful and felt rich for the first time in his life and thought no further than school supplies. 11 years old and overawed and hungry for the world that was suddenly opening up to him, he hadn't thought to ask any of the questions that, looking back, screamed to be asked. How had the vault been managed in the decades since his parents died? Gringotts didn't manage itself. Someone had to be authorized to make decisions about the estate. Who had that person been? What had they done with it? Were there other vaults? The Potters were an old family. His textbooks had mentioned that in passing. Old magical families sometimes had multiple vaults, ancestral seats, heirlooms and properties and investments that spanned generations. Had any of that come to him? Had anyone made sure it had? The cab pulled up outside the Leaky Cauldron, and Harry paid the driver from the small amount of Muggle money he'd kept, then stood on the pavement, and waited for Hagrid to extract himself from 2 taxis simultaneously. Tom the barman greeted them with wide eyes and an immediate offer of tea, which Hagrid accepted and Harry politely declined. They passed through the back of the pub, into the courtyard, Hagrid tapping the bricks in their specific sequence, and the wall opened into Diagon Alley. It was quieter than it had been on his birthday. The back-to-school rush was over. Everyone was on the train or had already made their purchases, and the alley had settled into its ordinary afternoon rhythm. Shopkeepers rearranged windows. A wizard in lime green robes argued with a cart vendor about the price of something Harry couldn't see. A cat slept in a patch of sunlight outside the apothecary. Gringotts rose at the far end of the alley like a statement of architectural intent. White marble columns, bronze doors, the words engraved above the entrance that Harry had read on his first visit, and which now felt significantly more pointed than they had then. Enter, stranger, but take heed of what awaits the sin of greed. He walked toward it with Hagrid lumbering behind him, already composing his opening line. The goblin at the first desk looked at Harry with the particular expression that goblins seem to reserve for humans who were taking up their time, a precise, calibrated blankness that communicated both perfect professionalism and the suggestion that it would prefer to be doing something else. "I'd like to speak with someone about my family vault," Harry said. "And about the management of the Potter estate. Do you have an account?" The goblin's voice was like gravel in a tin. "I have Vault 687. My name is Harry Potter." He'd been on the receiving end of many different kinds of looks in his life. The Dursleys had a look. His teachers at primary school had had a look. The particular mix of wariness and pity that came with knowing a child was going home to something they couldn't quite intervene in. The wizarding world, he'd already discovered, had its own special look reserved for his name. But the look the goblin gave him now was different. It wasn't awe, exactly, or reverence. It was something more like assessment. Rapid, thorough, and almost immediately focused. "One moment," the goblin said and moved. Harry stood at the desk and watched it go. Behind him, he heard Hagrid shifting his weight and clearing his throat in the way that meant he was worried but didn't know what to say. "Harry," Hagrid said quietly. "Just be careful how you talk to them, yeah? Goblins are people," Harry said, "who are very good at their jobs and have probably dealt with worse than me." He glanced back. "I'll be respectful. But I'm not going to be managed out of asking questions that I'm legally entitled to ask." Hagrid blinked. "How do you know you're legally entitled?" Chapter 7 of Magical Law for the Modern Witch and Wizard. Harry turned back to the desk. "Vault holders over 11 have the right of audit and estate review. It's in the standard Gringotts account charter. I read it the night after you told me about the break-in." Hagrid was quiet for a moment. "Your parents would have loved ya," he said finally, and his voice was a little rough. Harry kept his eyes forward and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't break the composure he needed right now. The first goblin returned with a second goblin, shorter, older, with the kind of face that had been calculating things for so long it had taken on the quality of a mathematical instrument. He wore a coat that was slightly better cut than the others and walked with the specific authority of someone who had earned the right to walk that way over a very long time. "Mr. Potter," the older goblin said, "I am Ragnarok, Deputy Director of Estate Management." He looked at Harry with those dark, unblinking eyes. "You are requesting an estate audit and management review of the Potter holdings?" "Yes," Harry said. "All of them. Including any properties, any secondary vaults, any ongoing account management instructions, and the identity of whoever has been authorized to act on behalf of my estate since November 1981. Ragnarok was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, "That is a significant request. It's been a significant 10 years. Something moved in the goblin's face, not quite a smile, more the ghost of a smile, the mathematical memory of one. "Indeed. Please follow me, Mr. Potter." Hagrid started forward and Ragnarok held up one hand without looking at him. "The vault account is in Mr. Potter's name alone. You may wait in the lobby." Hagrid looked at Harry. Harry looked at Hagrid. "It's okay," he said. "I'll be fine. I'll be right here." "Yell if I'll be fine, Hagrid." He followed Ragnarok through a door behind the main counter, into a corridor that had clearly not been designed with human proportions in mind. The ceilings were lower here, the lighting different, warmer, more amber, and the sound from the main hall dropped away immediately. They passed 3 doors, went down a short flight of stairs, and came into a room that was small and neat and entirely covered, on every wall, with filed drawers. A younger goblin was already there, pulling drawers and laying folders on the central table with the efficiency of someone who had been told what to find and had found it. Ragnar gestured to a chair. Harry sat. The Potter estate audit, Ragnar said, settling across from him. We will begin with what has been accessed, and then proceed to the full holdings inventory. Before we do. He paused, and this pause felt deliberate, carefully chosen. I want to ask you a direct question, Mr. Potter, which you may answer directly or decline to answer. Why now? You turned 11 this July. You have had access to this vault for 61 days. Why did you not simply board the school train as expected? Harry looked at him. Because someone tried to rob a vault in this bank on the same day I visited my vault, and the object they were trying to steal was apparently important enough that the most powerful wizard in Britain sent a half-giant to retrieve it personally. And no one told me any of this, and I've been wondering ever since what else no one has thought to tell me. He paused. Also, I slept in a cupboard for 10 years while my family's gold sat in that vault downstairs. Someone made that decision. I want to know who. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Ragnar looked at the folders on the table. Looked at Harry. Then he opened the first folder, and began. 1 hour and 40 minutes. That was how long it took Ragnar and his colleague, whose name was Sharptooth, which Harry thought was either wonderfully literal or wonderfully ironic, to walk him through the Potter estate in its entirety. Harry sat through it with his hands flat on the table and his face very still and let the numbers and the facts and the implications wash over him in sequence, building a picture that became more troubling with each new piece. The primary vault, 687, held approximately 43,000 galleons in liquid assets, gold, silver, bronze, plus several sealed investment parcels that Gringotts managed on a rotating basis. This was the vault Harry had seen, the vault the mountain of coins came from. It was, by all accounts, not particularly exceptional for a family of the Potter's standing. The secondary vault, 412, was different. Vault 412 was the Potter family vault, the ancestral vault, opened in 1692 when Linfred of Stinchcomb's direct line formally took the Potter name and registered with the newly chartered Gringotts. It held, among other things, 812,000 galleons in liquid assets, a collection of pre-ministry magical artifacts valued at somewhere north of 2 million galleons, the deed to Potter's Field in Godric's Hollow, which technically included the ruins of the cottage, the deed to Potter Manor in Derbyshire, currently standing empty, under stasis enchantments, apparently, the deed to a property in Hogsmeade, and a collection of Potter family documents going back 3 centuries that Sharptooth described, without changing expression, as extensive. Harry had not known Vault 412 existed. No one had ever mentioned it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked, Who has access to Vault 412? Ragnar turned to the relevant page. Under standard inheritance protocols, access would have transferred fully to you upon your 11th birthday. Prior to that, the vault would have been under the management of the appointed estate guardian. And who is the appointed estate guardian? Ragnar paused. According to the estate management order filed with Gringotts in December of 1981, that guardianship was assigned to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry kept his face still. And the guardianship, it transferred to me automatically at 11? It should have. Ragnar's tone was precisely neutral. However, the management order included a renewal clause. Because no minor heir had presented at Gringotts to claim majority guardianship before the expiry date. He turned another page. The guardianship has been auto-renewed on an annual basis. The most recent renewal was this past August. The room was very quiet. He renewed it in August, Harry said. After I turned 11. After I'd already visited my primary vault. The renewal occurred on August the 15th. Your birthday is July 31st. Ragnar looked at him steadily. We flagged it for review when it came through. It is irregular. Has Vault 412 been accessed under this guardianship? Another page. Sharptooth set a different folder on the table, this one thicker, its edges worn. There are 47 withdrawal transactions recorded against Vault 412 between December 1981 and the present date, Ragnar said. In total, They represent approximately 132,000 galleons in withdrawals, plus several artifact loans and one property rental agreement for the Hogsmeade property. The Hogsmeade property had been rented out for 10 years. The rental income had been deposited into a Dumbledore-managed discretionary account. Mr. Potter, Ragnock said, I want to be precise about what I am and am not telling you. The withdrawals and management decisions made under an estate guardianship are, in principle, legal. Dumbledore held legitimate guardianship papers. He was authorized to make these transactions. In principle, Harry said. The renewal of the guardianship after your 11th birthday, in the absence of any court order extending the guardianship beyond the standard term, is considerably less clear. Ragnock's expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had sharpened. The standard term of a magical minor's estate guardianship expires upon the child's first visit to Gringotts to claim their vault. You visited Vault 687 on July 31st. He paused. The guardianship of Vault 412 should arguably have terminated on that date. But it was renewed 2 weeks later. Yes. Harry looked at the table. He looked at the numbers on the page, the 47 withdrawals, the 132,000 galleons, the rental income quietly accumulating in an account that had never once been mentioned to him. He thought about Dumbledore's half-moon glasses and his gentle eyes and the way he'd spoken to Harry through letters, warm, but always steering, always shepherding toward the path that Dumbledore had already decided Harry should walk. He thought about the train he hadn't gotten on. I want a full written audit report, he said. Everything, both vaults, all transactions, the guardianship paperwork, the renewal documentation, and the rental records for the Hogsmeade property. He looked at Ragnock. Is there anything else I should know? Ragnock and Sharktooth exchanged a look. It was quick, barely a flicker, but Harry caught it. There was, Ragnock said, a Potter family will. Harry stilled. James and Lily Potter filed a joint will with Gringotts in October of 1981, 1 month before their deaths. Ragnock's voice was, if anything, more precisely neutral than it had been before. The will was also filed with the Wizengamot as required by law for estates of significant value. I've never seen it, Harry said. No one has ever mentioned it. No. A pause. The will was sealed by ministry order in November of 1981, shortly after the Potters' deaths. Ragnock selected a document from the back of the folder and laid it on the table. The sealing order was signed by then-Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Albus Dumbledore, citing national security concerns related to you-know-who's defeat. Harry looked at the document. At the looping, elegant signature at the bottom. He sealed his own client's will, Harry said. Technically, as Chief Warlock at the time, he had the authority. I didn't ask about the technicality. Harry looked up. I asked what happened. The faintest shift in Ragnock's expression. The will has remained sealed for 10 years. Without a successful ministry petition, it cannot be opened. However, he produced a second, smaller document. Gringotts retains a sealed summary of the will's key provisions, for purposes of estate administration. This summary was provided to us at the time of the will's filing, before it was sealed. It is not subject to the ministry sealing order. He slid it across the table. Harry picked it up. The summary was written in the cramped, formal script of a legal document, and it was short, a single page. Harry read it twice to make sure he understood it properly. James and Lily Potter's will had specified, in order of preference, the following guardians for their son Harry James Potter: Sirius Orion Black, Remus John Lupin, Frank and Alice Longbottom, and, in the event that all of the above were unavailable or unwilling, any wizarding family approved by Gringotts acting in the child's financial interest. The will had explicitly, in underlined text that someone had clearly felt strongly about, prohibited the placement of Harry Potter with Petunia Evans Dursley or any Muggle-born relatives, citing concerns about the child's magical development and safety. Harry set the document down. He was very quiet for a moment. Then, Sirius Black is in Azkaban. Yes, Ragnock said. Did he have a trial? Another of those small, precise pauses. Gringotts does not have access to Ministry criminal records. We cannot answer that question definitively. He looked at Harry. However, we have noted, in our own records, that Sirius Black was listed as the primary beneficiary of the Black family's secondary accounts, held in trust pending the resolution of his circumstances. Those accounts have been in suspension for 10 years. No trial date has ever been communicated to us. Harry put his hand flat on the table. He pressed it down, felt the cool stone beneath the paper, and used it to keep himself very precisely located in his own body. 10 years. Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for 10 years without a trial. The Potters' will had named him as Harry's guardian. The will had been sealed by Dumbledore. Dumbledore had then become Harry's de facto estate guardian. Harry had spent 10 years in a cupboard under the stairs in a house that the will had explicitly said he shouldn't go to. He looked at Ragnarok. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Goblins, Ragnarok said, are always honest. We merely choose what to be honest about. Fair enough. What happens if I formally challenge the guardianship renewal? The August renewal, the one that happened after I'd already claimed my vault? Ragnarok was quiet for a count of 3. That would initiate a formal Gringotts estate dispute. We would file with the Wisengamot on your behalf. The guardianship would be suspended pending review, which means no further transactions could be made against Vault 412. The prior transactions would be subject to audit. He paused. It would also require Dumbledore to respond formally, in writing, to the Wisengamot. And the will? A Gringotts estate dispute of sufficient scope can petition for the unsealing of relevant documents. The will would likely be considered relevant. Ragnarok folded his hands on the table. The process would not be quick, Mr. Potter. And it would be visible. Good, Harry said. I want it to be visible. He straightened in his chair. Filed the challenge. And I want that audit report ready as soon as possible. Can I also request that Gringotts act as my independent financial representative in any Wisengamot proceedings? Rather than having a wizard solicitor? Something that was definitely the memory of a smile moved across Ragnarok's face. That would be unusual. Is it legal? It is unprecedented. Which is different from illegal. Is it something Gringotts would consider? Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Sharptooth, who had been standing in the corner of the room being very professionally invisible throughout the entire conversation, and said something in gobbledygook that Harry couldn't follow. Sharptooth responded in kind. Then Ragnarok turned back. Gringotts would consider it, he said. With conditions. Tell me the conditions. We would require access to conduct a full audit of all Potter holdings, including any properties that may have been subject to action under the guardianship. We would require formal acknowledgement that Gringotts acts in the financial interest of the Potter estate, and not as an agent of the Ministry or of any individual wizard. And we would require— Ragnarok's eyes were very dark and very sharp. We would require that you understand what you are doing. Not what you think you are doing, what you are actually doing. Because this will not be a quiet conversation, Mr. Potter. This will not go away when you board your school train. If you file this challenge, it will follow you. Harry held his gaze. My parents' will was sealed. Their money was managed without my knowledge or consent. Sirius Black has been in prison for 10 years, and as far as I can tell, no one ever asked whether he actually deserved to be there. I slept in a cupboard until I was 10 years old, and the most powerful wizard in Britain apparently filed paperwork in August to make sure he kept control of my family's money. He paused. I'm 11. I know I'm 11. But I'm also a Potter, apparently, which means something in this world, and I'm the only one who seems to be paying attention. He met Ragnarok's eyes. I understand what I'm doing. The room was very quiet. Then Ragnarok made a decision. Harry could see it, not just in what the goblin said next, but in a small shift of his posture, the way he laid both hands flat on the table in a gesture that might have been deliberate and might have been entirely unconscious. I will assign you a Gringotts advocate, Ragnarok said. His name is Grivhook. He is young for this kind of work, but he is thorough. He will prepare the filing and escort you to any proceedings. A pause. He will also, if you are agreeable, accompany you to your school for the initial term, as your official estate representative. Gringotts has the right to station a representative with any minor account holder during an open dispute. Harry thought about that. He'd come to Hogwarts? If you wished it. The school is obligated to accommodate him. Professor Dumbledore. Ragnar's pause was extremely precise. Would not be able to prevent it. Harry almost smiled. Yes. I'd like that very much. Griphook, it turned out, was exactly as young as Ragnar had implied by goblin standards, which meant he looked about the age of someone's very serious grandfather rather than their very serious great-great-great-great-grandfather. He had clever eyes and hands that moved constantly, as if they were always in the middle of calculating something, and when Ragnar introduced him to Harry and explained what was required, he looked Harry over with an expression that was measuring in the most literal sense. You have read the account charter, Griphook said. It wasn't a question. Chapter 7, Harry confirmed. The section on audit rights. And the section on guardian dispute protocols. And the standard interest clauses. He paused. Though I think my arithmetic on the interest owed on the Hogsmeade rental income might be off. I was doing it in my head. Griphook looked at him for another moment. Then he turned to Ragnar and said something in gobbledygook. Ragnar replied. Griphook looked back at Harry. Your arithmetic, he said, was off by approximately 40 galleons. You underestimated the compound rate in years 3 through 7. He tilted his head. You were close. I'll be more accurate with a pencil. Something crossed Griphook's face that might, in a different context, have been respect. He turned to the table and began, with brisk efficiency, to gather folders. It was late afternoon by the time Harry walked back out through the bronze doors of Gringotts and into Diagon Alley. The sun was lower, the shadows longer, and the alley was even quieter now, just the ordinary late afternoon hum of people finishing their shopping and beginning to think about supper. Hagrid was sitting on the steps. He stood up when Harry appeared, unfolding himself from the stone with the slightly pained look of a man who had been sitting in an uncomfortable position for nearly 2 hours and knew it. Well? He said. Harry looked up at him. He had a folder under his arm, a copy of everything Ragnar had shown him, plus the preliminary audit findings and the formal filing notice that would go to the Wizengamot first thing tomorrow morning. My family had 2 vaults, Harry said. I knew about one of them. The other one has had about 130,000 galleons taken out of it over the last 10 years, managed by Dumbledore under a guardianship that should have ended when I visited my vault in July. He paused. My parents also left a will, which Dumbledore sealed using his authority as Chief Warlock. And Sirius Black, my parents named him as my guardian in the will, has apparently been in Azkaban for 10 years without a trial. Hagrid stared at him. Griphook will be filing a formal estate dispute with the Wizengamot tomorrow morning. Harry continued. He's also going to be accompanying me to Hogwarts as my official estate representative. He looked at Hagrid's expression, which had passed through several distinct phases and was currently settling somewhere between dismay and a complicated kind of awe. I'm going to need somewhere to stay tonight. Not Privet Drive. Harry. Hagrid's voice was rough. I didn't know about any of. I know you didn't. Harry looked up at him steadily. And I'm not angry, Hagrid. I'm really not. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to just let this go. And I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening, and I'm not going to let anyone convince me that the right thing to do is forget all of it and focus on school. He shifted the folder under his arm. Where can I sleep tonight? I'd rather not go back to the Dursleys. Hagrid was very still. Then, slowly, he put one massive hand on Harry's shoulder, gently, the way you touched something you were afraid of breaking, which was strange because Harry was fairly sure no one had ever treated him like something that could break before. There's rooms over the leaky cauldron, Hagrid said quietly. Tom will set you up. I'll stay too if yet want company. I'd like that, Harry said. They walked back down Diagon Alley together in the late afternoon light, and somewhere in London, a train full of first-years was pulling into Hogsmeade Station without him, and Harry Potter felt, for the first time in his life, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wrote 3 letters that night, sitting at the desk in his small room above the leaky cauldron while Hedwig watched from the windowsill and the sounds of London came up from the street below. The first letter was to Albus Dumbledore. It was short, polite, and gave nothing away. It simply notified him that Harry would be arriving at Hogwarts late due to personal matters requiring his attention, that he had arranged for appropriate accommodation in the interim, and that he looked forward to beginning his education at the professor's earliest convenience. He read it back twice to make sure it contained no questions and no accusations and no indication of what was in the folder beside him. The second letter was to Remus Lupin. He'd found the name in the will summary, and Grip Hook had helped him locate a forwarding address through Gringotts' own records. Estate-related correspondence for secondary guardians was still technically held on file. The letter was longer. He explained who he was, which felt strange. "Hello, I'm Harry Potter, you probably knew my parents," and what he'd found, and that he wasn't sure where things would go from here, but that he thought Lupin deserved to know. The third letter he stared at for a long time before he began it. To Sirius Black. I don't know if you can receive letters in Azkaban. I don't know if you're my godfather or my parents' betrayer or something else entirely. I know that my parents will name you as my guardian. I know you didn't get a trial. I know that the person who was supposed to take care of me went to Azkaban for a crime you may or may not have committed, and I went to a cupboard for a life that should have been very different. I'm not writing to accuse you. I'm writing because I'm 11 years old and I just found out that my entire life was managed by people who made decisions without asking me, and the only way any of it gets better is if someone starts asking questions. I'm asking. Harry Potter. He sealed all 3 with wax. Grip Hook had given him a Potter family seal from the vault documents, a small brass thing stamped with a stag, and handed them to Hedwig one by one, telling her who each was for. She took the first 2 without comment. She held the third one in her beak and looked at him for a moment, her amber eyes very serious. I know, he said. Do your best. She stepped off the windowsill and was gone into the London dark. Harry sat at the desk for a while after, watching the city lights and listening to the distant sound of traffic. He opened the audit folder and read through it again, slowly, making notes in the margins where something needed following up. He calculated the compound interest on the rental income, with a pencil this time, and Grip Hook had been right. He'd been off by 37 galleons, not 40. Close enough. At some point, Hagrid knocked on the door and handed in a plate of sandwiches and a mug of tea without being asked, and Harry ate them at the desk without looking up from the documents. And Hagrid didn't say anything, just left the door slightly open in a way that felt like company. It was, Harry thought, the best evening he'd ever had. Not because anything was solved, almost nothing was solved. The estate dispute hadn't been heard yet. The will was still sealed. Sirius Black was still in Azkaban. Dumbledore had no idea that any of this was coming, and when he found out, there would be consequences that Harry couldn't fully predict. But he knew things now. Real things, documented things, things he could hold and read and point to and say, this happened, and it was wrong, and I am going to deal with it. For the first time since Hagrid had handed him a letter in the middle of a storm-battered shack on a rock in the ocean, Harry felt like the world he'd been handed was actually his. He closed the folder and went to bed. He slept, for the first time in years, without dreaming. Chapter 2. What the Ledgers Say. The Wizengamot notice arrived at Dumbledore's office at Hogwarts at 7:14 in the morning. Harry knew this because Grip Hook told him, with the precise satisfaction of someone who had timed something perfectly, over a breakfast of toast and kippers in the leaky cauldron's small dining room. The goblin was already dressed in his Gringotts coat, a leather satchel on the bench beside him, a cup of something dark and bitter steaming at his elbow. The filing was submitted at 6 o'clock, Grip Hook said, spreading a document on the table between the plates. Standard processing puts delivery to named parties within 90 minutes. Dumbledore will have had it. He checked a small, complicated watch on his wrist. 7 minutes ago. Harry ate a piece of toast. What does it say? The notice. It informs him that a formal estate dispute has been filed against the guardianship of Vault 412, Potter Family Holdings, by the primary account holder. Griphook turned the document to face Harry. It requires him to submit a written response to the Wiesengemot within 14 days, detailing his legal basis for the August renewal and accounting for all transactions made under the guardianship. It also notifies him that Gringotts is acting as independent estate representative for the account holder, and that all future communication regarding Potter Holdings should be directed to my office. Hagrid, sitting across the table with a mug the size of a small bucket, was reading the document upside down with an expression that cycled between impressed and deeply anxious. He's gonna be very upset, he said. Yes, Harry agreed. He probably will be. He might come here. He might. Harry picked up his tea. That's fine. I haven't done anything wrong. Hagrid opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Griphook, and then said, with the tone of a man trying to articulate something complicated, It's not about wrong, Harry. It's Dumbledore's used to being the person who handles things. He's handled things very thoroughly, Harry said pleasantly. For about 10 years without asking me. I think it's my turn. Griphook made a sound that was probably the goblin equivalent of a laugh, very short, very dry, like a door being opened and immediately closed again. They had 3 things to do today, Griphook had explained over an earlier and more businesslike conversation before Hagrid had come down to breakfast. First, Harry needed to access Vault 412 in person, which would formally register him as the active account holder and complicate any attempt to contest his standing in the dispute. Second, Harry needed to retrieve certain documents from that vault, specifically, any correspondence between the Potter family and Dumbledore that predated the will sealing, and anything relating to the Fidelius charm that had been meant to protect his parents. Third, and most importantly, they needed to visit the Ministry of Magic. Not to make trouble, Griphook had said, in a tone that suggested he would not have objected to making trouble. To file. Under a section of the Wiesengemot Charter that Harry had found referenced in the back pages of the estate charter document, a section titled Provisions for Orphaned Heirs of Significant Standing, a minor who had been improperly denied access to their estate had the right to petition for an emergency Wiesengemot hearing within 72 hours of formally opening a dispute. The petition required the support of an established magical institution, which Gringotts was providing. The 72-hour clock was running. Eat your breakfast, Griphook said, which was, Harry thought, probably the most parental thing a goblin had ever said to him. We leave in 30 minutes. Vault 412 was on the 3rd level down. The cart ride was longer than it had been to Vault 687, curving deeper into the earth through tunnels that grew progressively older and colder, the stone walls giving way to something rawer and darker. Harry kept his hands on the cart's edge and watched the lantern light skate across the rock and thought about the fact that he'd been here before, on his birthday, and gone home with a handful of galleons and no idea that any of this was underneath him. The vault door was different from 687's. Heavier, older, carved with what Griphook identified as protective runic script, the kind that predated the Ministry's establishment of standard warding protocols. There was a slot for a key, but also a second mechanism that Griphook activated by pressing his palm flat against the door and speaking 3 words in gobbledygook. Blood recognition, Harry said, watching. Estate recognition, Griphook corrected. The vault recognizes the assigned estate representative in the absence of a living account holder. Until this morning, that was Dumbledore. He stepped back. Now it's you. He looked at Harry. Your hand, Mr. Potter. Flat on the door below mine. Harry stepped forward and pressed his palm to the stone. The vault door didn't clang open the way 687's did. It opened the way something old and heavy opened when it was ready, slowly, without drama, without the noise, like it was simply deciding to let him through. The smell that came out was different from the other vault. Richer, older, the faint scent of parchment and candle wax and something herbal underneath it all, like lavender dried long ago. The lantern Griphook carried caught the gold first, But it wasn't just coins. The gold here was in different forms, sealed bars stacked against one wall, the mountains of galleons and sickles and nuts that Harry had been expecting, but also cases of what looked like jewelry and smaller objects, a row of locked chests along the far wall, shelves of bottled things, and at the back, a wooden cabinet that took up the entire rear wall and was fitted with hundreds of small labeled drawers. Harry walked in slowly. The numbers Ragnarok had quoted him came alive in a different way when the actual objects were in front of you. 800,000 galleons in a bank ledger was a number. 800,000 galleons in bars and coins and sealed investments in a vault the size of a modest house was a physical reality that settled into his chest with a weight he hadn't expected. His parents had had this. Had walked in here, had known this was theirs, had made decisions with it. And then they died, and no one had told him any of it existed. He breathed through it. He filed it away for later. There was a lot being filed away for later, and he was going to need a very big drawer, and turned to the shelves. Documents, Griphook said, already moving toward the rear cabinet. Estate management records will be in here. The Potters were organized. He pulled a drawer. Family correspondence is separate from financial records. Another drawer. This one. The drawer held perhaps 30 letters, bundled in ribbon. Harry lifted them out carefully. He didn't have time to read them all here. Griphook had been very clear about the schedule, but he untied the bundle and sorted through them quickly enough to get a sense of what was there. Most of them were between James Potter and a solicitor Harry didn't recognize, dealing with property matters and investment decisions. A few were from people Harry didn't know yet, names he might learn later, friends of his parents from a war he'd only heard references to. 3 of them were from Dumbledore. Harry set the others aside and read those 3. The first was dated March 1981, 8 months before his parents' deaths. It was friendly, avuncular in the way of all Dumbledore's correspondence that Harry had already begun to recognize, full of careful warmth and gentle guidance. It suggested, in beautifully crafted sentences, that James and Lily considered the Fidelius charm as a protection for themselves and young Harry, and recommended Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper. It noted that Sirius Black, while loyal, was perhaps too obvious a choice, too well known as your closest friend, and that the less expected option was always more secure. It was signed with warmest regards and deepest respect for your courage. The second letter was from September 1981, 6 weeks before they died. It was shorter. It acknowledged that James and Lily had proceeded with the Fidelius charm and thanked them for trusting his counsel regarding the secret keeper. It expressed confidence that they were now as safe as he could make them. Harry looked at that phrase for a moment. As safe as he could make them. As if their safety was something Dumbledore was responsible for making. The third letter was undated and was not, technically, a letter. It was a note. 4 lines, in a different hand than the other 2. Hurried, the ink slightly smeared as if it had been written quickly. Albus, Peter has been behaving strangely. I don't trust him. I want to switch to Sirius. Please advise urgently. James. There was no reply letter. Just a note, sitting in the bundle with the others. No indication of whether Dumbledore had ever responded to it, whether he'd said yes or no or nothing at all. They'd died 3 weeks after the note's implied urgency. The Fidelius charm had been broken. Voldemort had found them. Harry set the note down very carefully on top of the other 2 letters. Griphook was watching him from across the vault. I'll need these, Harry said. His voice was steady. I anticipated that. Griphook produced a flat case from his satchel. Preservation parchment. They'll be documented and sealed for evidence purposes. Harry handed them over. He watched Griphook's careful, quick hands handle the letters with the efficiency of someone for whom other people's pain was a professional matter, and he was glad for that, glad for the lack of sentimentality, the absence of the soft-eyed sympathy that would have made the moment harder to be inside. He looked around the vault once more. The locked chests, he said. What's in them? We'll need to schedule a separate visit with a full inventory team. Griphook sealed the preservation case. This week if you wish. Yes. Harry took one more look at the rows of gold, and the shelves of bottled things, and the cabinet of drawers, and the physical reality of 10 years of not knowing, and then walked back out of the vault. The door closed behind him with the same slow, decided finality with which it had opened. The Ministry of Magic was underground. Harry had not known this, which was apparently another gap in his education that could be chalked up to the last decade's general mismanagement. He stood in a red telephone box in the middle of a London street and followed Griphook's instructions for the entry sequence, and then the floor descended and the box became a lift, and the lift became a vast underground atrium that opened out around him like someone's idea of a marble dream. Gold statues. Fireplaces along one wall, each flaring green as witches and wizards arrived and departed in showers of soot. A security desk just ahead. People moving in every direction, robes in every color, owls in transit cages overhead, the low rumbling hum of an institution in perpetual bureaucratic motion. Griphook walked like he owned the floor. Harry matched his pace. The security wizard at the desk took Harry's name and purpose, estate petition, provision 7 of the orphaned heirs charter, and spent approximately 45 seconds trying to decide how to react before settling on confused deference. A badge was printed. Harry clipped it to his shirt. Harry Potter, estate petitioner. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite satisfaction, something between the two, sharp and quiet. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was on level 2. They took the lift. The lift, it turned out, announced its stops in a bored female voice and was crowded with ministry workers who, when they registered who was standing in the corner, went through a very compressed sequence of emotions ranging from recognition to disbelief to the particular social agony of wanting to stare at someone while pretending not to stare at someone. Harry looked straight ahead. Griphook, beside him, was completely unbothered by all of it. Level 2 opened into a corridor lined with office doors, most of them closed, several of them with queues of people waiting outside. Griphook led Harry past all of them to a door at the far end marked petitions and charter applications, senior office, and knocked twice. The wizard who opened the door was around 50, gray-haired, with the look of someone who had been doing paperwork for a very long time and had made his peace with it. He looked at Griphook. He looked at Harry. He looked at Griphook again. "Bertram Entwistle," Griphook said without preamble. "We have a Provision 7 petition, Potter Estate, minor account holder present in person. I believe you'll find the supporting documentation from Gringotts was received this morning." Entwistle looked at Harry. You're Harry Potter." "Yes," Harry said. "And I'd like to file a petition for an emergency Wisengamot hearing. The supporting documentation includes evidence of irregular guardianship management, an improperly sealed family will, and potential violation of standard inheritance protocols." He paused. "Also, I think there's a question about whether someone got a trial that I'd like answered, but I understand that might be a separate department." There was a pause. "Come in," Entwistle said. The office smelled like old parchment and ink and the faint ghost of someone's lunch. Every surface was covered in stacked documents except for a cleared space on Entwistle's desk, which Harry suspected had been cleared specifically for the appearance of being a person with a manageable workload. Griphook settled his satchel on the floor and produced folders with the organized efficiency of someone who had prepared for this meeting very thoroughly. The petition itself took 40 minutes to file. Not because it was complicated, Griphook had already prepared it, but because Entwistle kept stopping to reread sections of the supporting documentation with an expression that started at professional neutrality and progressed, visibly, to something Harry could only describe as low-grade institutional alarm. "The August renewal of the guardianship," Entwistle said, for the second time, holding the document up as though a different angle might change what it said. "After I had already visited Vault 687, which should have been sufficient to terminate the minor status of the account," Griphook confirmed, in the tone of someone explaining something to a person who understood it perfectly well and simply didn't want to. "And the will sealing, signed by Dumbledore in his capacity as Chief Warlock, yes. The Gringotts will summary is in the 3rd folder." The discrepancy between the will's specified guardian, Sirius Black, and the actual placement of the child is documented on the attached table. Entwistle put the document down and looked at Harry. Not the look that said you are 11 and therefore I don't need to take you seriously, which Harry had been expecting and had prepared for. The look that said you are 11 and this is a very serious situation and I'm not entirely sure how to process both of those things simultaneously. Mr. Potter, he said, is there a wizarding adult accompanying you through this process? A guardian or, Gringotts is my estate representative, Harry said. Griphook speaks on my behalf in all financial and legal matters relating to my estate. He paused. I also have Rubius Hagrid, Keeper of Keys at Hogwarts, who has been acting as my point of contact with the wizarding world since July. He's waiting downstairs. But you don't have no. I don't have a wizard guardian. That's rather the point of the petition. Harry looked at him levelly. The person who was supposed to be my guardian is in Azkaban. The person who made sure he stayed there also managed to become my estate guardian and seal my parents' will. He kept his voice reasonable, unhurried. I'm not asking anyone to throw Dumbledore in prison. I'm asking for a Wizengamot hearing where these questions can be answered properly, in front of appropriate witnesses, with documentation. A pause. That's what the petition is for. Entwistle looked at the petition. He looked at the folders. He rubbed the bridge of his nose in a way that suggested he had not anticipated this particular Tuesday. I'll need to file this with the Chief Warlock's office, he said. Given the complexity of... He stopped himself. Given that the sitting Chief Warlock is named in the petition, I'll need to file with the deputy. That's Madame Longbottom. Harry thought about that. Augusta Longbottom. He didn't know much about her, but the name was in his parents' will as a tertiary guardian choice. Frank and Alice Longbottom's family. That seems appropriate, he said. Please proceed. Entwistle picked up a quill. Then he put it down. Then he looked at Harry again with the look of a man who needed to say something and wasn't sure it was his place. Yes? Harry said. I've been working in this department for 19 years, Entwistle said. In those 19 years, I have never had an 11-year-old come in here, alone except for a goblin, and file a Provision 7 petition against the Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot. He paused. I've also never had one come in who actually knew what a Provision 7 petition was. Chapter 7 of the Estate Charter, Harry said. But also the back pages of magical law for the modern witch and wizard, if you count the appendix. The appendix, Entwistle repeated. You read the appendix. I read everything. Harry looked at him simply. Nobody was going to read it for me. Entwistle picked up his quill again and started writing. He had the expression of a man who had just decided something, though Harry couldn't quite tell what. He wrote for a few minutes, sealed the document, and rang a small bell on his desk that summoned a young witch from the outer office. To Deputy Chief Warlock Longbottom, he said, handing her the sealed envelope. Mark it urgent. Official petition business. He looked at Harry. You'll receive a notification of hearing date within 48 hours. Given the Provision 7 urgency clause, the hearing must be scheduled within 72 hours of the petition being accepted. He paused. Assuming Deputy Longbottom accepts it. Do you think she will? Harry asked. Entwistle looked at him steadily. Augusta Longbottom, he said, has never once in 30 years of Wizengamot service backed down from something that needed doing because it was politically inconvenient. He allowed himself a small, precise expression that was almost dry. I think she will accept it. They ate lunch in a small cafe in Muggle London because, as Griphook observed with perfect logic, no one in Diagon Alley would be able to see them eating lunch without it becoming an event, and they didn't have time for events. Hagrid ate approximately 4 sandwiches and half a pie that the cafe's staff regarded with understandable alarm. Griphook ate something he'd brought from his own bag and studied documents while he ate, which Harry found both admirable and slightly unsettling. Harry ate a cheese sandwich and thought. The letters from the vault sat in the preservation case in Griphook's satchel. He kept thinking about the last one, James Potter's handwriting, hurried and anxious, asking Dumbledore to let him switch secret keepers, and no reply. No reply that had made it into the vault, anyway. Maybe Dumbledore had replied, had said yes or no or wait, James, let's discuss, but the absence of a reply in a vault that contained every other piece of estate correspondence was its own kind of evidence. He thought about Peter Pettigrew. Everyone he'd read about in the histories, in A History of Magic, in the supplementary books he'd bought, in the references he'd tracked down in the Leaky Cauldron's small library of back issues of The Prophet, described the aftermath of his parents' deaths in the same way. Sirius Black, the traitor, had hunted Peter Pettigrew down and blown up a street, killing 12 Muggles, when Pettigrew had confronted him about betraying the Potters. Pettigrew had died. Black had been arrested. 12 dead Muggles and a piece of finger. That was the evidence. That was all of it. No trial. Just Azkaban. Harry drank his water and watched the Muggle street outside the window and thought about the specific mechanics of a man who could transform into a rat. Griphook, he said. The goblin looked up from his document. If Sirius Black were innocent, Harry said carefully, and Peter Pettigrew were alive, is there a way that Gringotts would know? Would Pettigrew have a vault, for instance? Griphook's hand stilled. Just for a moment. Then he set down the document and looked at Harry with those dark, calculating eyes. Every registered witch and wizard in Britain has some financial record at Gringotts, he said. Whether a vault, a managed investment, a recorded transaction. He was quiet for a moment. The record for Peter Pettigrew would be filed as a deceased account, which means it would be sealed but not closed. And if the account were still showing activity, it would be flagged as an anomaly. Griphook picked up his document again. I am not, at present, authorized to review third-party accounts. No, Harry said. But if someone at Gringotts were to notice an anomaly in a deceased account, they'd be required to flag it for review, wouldn't they? Standard banking protocols. A pause. That would be standard practice, yes. I'm just asking about the protocol, Harry said pleasantly. Griphook looked at him. Looked back at his document. I will speak with the records department, he said in a tone that meant he had already decided to speak with the records department and was simply filing the decision properly. Hagrid had been listening to this exchange with growing bewilderment. Harry, he said slowly. Are you saying Pettigrew might be? I'm saying my parents will name Sirius Black as my guardian, which means my parents trusted him completely. I'm saying the only evidence against Black was the testimony of witnesses at the scene and the word of everyone who was there afterwards. I'm saying there was no trial, which means no one had to produce actual evidence. And I'm saying that Peter Pettigrew, the man who supposedly died, was the secret keeper. Harry looked at Hagrid. If I were innocent and I'd been framed, and I had a way to disappear and stay disappeared, I'd use it. Wouldn't I? Hagrid was very quiet. I don't know if Black is innocent, Harry said. I genuinely don't. But I know he didn't get a trial, and my parents trusted him, and someone made very sure that I never learned any of this. He set his water glass down. That's enough reason to ask the question. The notification from Deputy Chief Warlock Longbottom arrived at the Leaky Cauldron at 4:17 that afternoon, carried by a large and extremely official-looking owl that landed on Harry's windowsill with the gravity of something that knew it was important. Griphook opened it, read it, and handed it to Harry. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, 36 hours away. The Wisengamot's Emergency Session Chamber, Level 10 of the Ministry. All named parties to the petition had been notified, including Dumbledore. Harry read it twice, refolded it, and added it to the folder. Then he sat at the desk and pulled out fresh parchment, and wrote 2 more letters, one to Griphook detailing the questions he wanted raised at the hearing, one to the Department of Magical Records requesting publicly available information on the criminal proceedings of Sirius Black, case number and sentencing record. He sealed both and gave them to Hedwig, who had been watching the official owl with an expression of pure disdain. There was a knock at the door. Come in, Harry called. It was Tom, the barman, looking slightly flustered in the way that innkeepers looked when something unexpected was happening to their establishment. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Potter. There's a letter been sent here for you. Just arrived by Flo." He held out an envelope. Harry took it. The writing on the front was familiar, the same looping, deliberate script that had signed the estate guardianship renewal, that had written warm letters to his parents about protecting themselves. "Harry," it said on the outside. Not Mr. Potter. Not the formal address that Gringotts and the ministry had used. "Harry." He opened it. "My dear boy, I confess to being somewhat surprised by this morning's developments, though perhaps I should not be. You have always been, even from the very beginning, more perceptive than anyone gave you credit for, a quality that speaks very well of your parents. I do not write to argue or to contest the proceedings you have initiated. Those are your rights, and I would not dream of preventing you from exercising them. I write simply to ask whether we might speak, you and I, privately, before Thursday. There are things I would like to explain to you, Harry. Context that may help you understand certain decisions that were made in very difficult circumstances, for reasons that, I hope, you will come to appreciate. I am aware that this request may seem self-serving. Perhaps it is. But I have always cared very deeply for your well-being, and I would prefer to have certain conversations with you in a quiet room rather than a Wiesengemot chamber. If you are willing, I will come to the Leaky Cauldron tomorrow morning. If you would rather wait until Thursday, I will understand. Yours, with the greatest sincerity, Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it once. He read it again, this time paying attention to what it didn't say as much as what it did. It didn't deny anything. It didn't explain the guardianship renewal, or the sealed will, or the missing trial. It offered context and difficult circumstances, which were the vocabulary of someone preparing to explain why things that looked wrong were actually right when you understood the full picture. He put the letter on the desk and looked at it. Griphook appeared in the doorway. He had a room across the hall and had, apparently, very good hearing. "Well? He wants to meet before Thursday. Explain things?" Harry kept looking at the letter. "He says there's context." Griphook's expression was perfectly neutral. "And will you meet with him?" Harry thought about it properly. Not instinctively, not emotionally, but the way you thought about a chess problem. What did meeting accomplish? What did refusing accomplish? What information did each option give him and take from him? If he met with Dumbledore, Dumbledore would tell him things. Some of those things would be true. Some of them would be framed so carefully that they were technically true but shaped to leave particular impressions. He would be charming and warm and sad and very convincing, and Harry was 11 years old and had never in his life had someone look at him with genuine affection who wasn't Hagrid, and he was absolutely aware that this was exactly the vulnerability Dumbledore would navigate toward. If he refused, Dumbledore would come to the hearing without having softened Harry up first. He would also have no idea how much Harry actually knew. Harry looked at the letter. "Write back," he said. "Tell him yes. Tomorrow morning, here 9 o'clock. Public dining room, not a private room." He paused. "And ask Tom if there's a corner table that happens to be near where Griphook usually eats breakfast." Griphook looked at him. "I'm not trying to trick him," Harry said. "I just want you able to hear anything legally relevant to the estate case." "Is that a problem?" "That," Griphook said, "is standard practice for estate advocacy." He turned back to his room. "I'll arrange the table." Harry wrote the reply to Dumbledore, brief, polite, 9 o'clock tomorrow, looking forward to it, and sealed it and passed it to Tom to send by Flo. Then he sat with the original letter for another minute, looking at that word at the top. Harry. Not because Dumbledore didn't know his surname, but because Harry was warm and familiar and suggested a relationship of care, a bond of mutual affection, the comfortable intimacy of someone who had always had his best interests at heart. It was very well done. He folded it and put it in the folder with everything else. Morning came grey and damp, London drizzle against the window, the smell of breakfast coming up through the floorboards from the dining room below. Harry was already dressed and at his desk by 7, the audit folder open, when Hedwig came back with a reply from Remus Lupin. The letter was short. The handwriting had the slight unsteadiness of someone who hadn't been eating well, or sleeping well, or possibly both. Harry, I won't pretend this letter didn't shake me. It shook me badly, if I'm honest, and I think you deserve honesty. I've been not well. Not for some time. But the news you're describing, the will, Sirius, the guardianship, I need to think carefully before I say more. I don't want to tell you something wrong when you are already moving forward. What I can tell you, your parents loved you more than anything. They trusted Sirius more than anyone. And the night they died, something happened that none of us have ever fully understood. I would like to meet you. If you'll let me. Remus Lupin P.S. You have your mother's gift for asking the right questions. She used to do it the same way, not loudly, but persistently, until the question couldn't be ignored. Harry read the postscript 3 times. He wrote back Thursday afternoon, Leaky Cauldron. I'd like that very much. At 10 minutes to 9, he came downstairs. The dining room was mostly empty, a couple of witches near the window, an old wizard reading the prophet over his porridge, Tom moving between tables with practiced quiet. Grip Hook was already at a corner table, his breakfast in front of him, documents spread to one side in a way that looked entirely natural. Harry sat at a table in the middle of the room, not too far from Grip Hook, not too close, ordered tea and toast, and waited. At 9 o'clock exactly, the fireplace flared green, and Albus Dumbledore stepped through. He was taller than Harry had expected, though perhaps that was because the last time Harry had seen him had been at a distance, across the great hall on a visit Harry now understood had been engineered. He wore deep purple robes and his half-moon glasses, and his expression, when he spotted Harry, was a careful mixture of warmth and something more complicated underneath, the look of a man who was very, very good at being exactly what a situation required. He sat down across from Harry. Tom brought him tea without being asked, which suggested this was not Dumbledore's first visit. Harry, Dumbledore said. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Thank you for coming, Harry said. His voice was easy. Milk? Thank you, no. Dumbledore looked at him over his glasses with those famously sharp blue eyes, and Harry had the distinct impression of being assessed in much the same way as Ragnarok had assessed him 2 days ago, but differently. Where Ragnarok had been calculating value, Dumbledore was calculating something else. Gap, maybe? How much does he know? You look well, Dumbledore said. London agrees with you. I've been busy, Harry said. But yes, it's been a good few days. He picked up his tea. You said you wanted to explain things? Dumbledore wrapped his hands around his own cup. I did. I do. He paused, and the pause was weighted in the way that Dumbledore's pauses, Harry suspected, were always weighted. Harry, I want to begin by acknowledging that from your perspective, discovering these things without context, without someone to help you understand, it must look very troubling. Some of it is troubling, Harry said agreeably. Particularly the will. Yes. Dumbledore looked at him. The will. My parents specified a guardian. That guardian has been in Azkaban for 10 years. I ended up in a cupboard. Harry kept his voice conversational. I'm genuinely curious about the sequence of events there. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not the weighted kind of quiet, this time, something more real, something that Harry thought might actually be discomfort. The night your parents died was chaos, Harry. True chaos. Voldemort's defeat happened suddenly, unexpectedly, and the aftermath was overwhelming. Sirius Black was found at the site of 12 deaths, without a trial, Harry said. The Ministry, without a trial, Harry said again. Pleasantly. Simply. Like a person making sure a detail hadn't been missed. Dumbledore stopped. I looked it up, Harry said. In the Department of Records request I filed yesterday. There are no court records for Sirius Black. No trial date, no conviction record, no sentencing hearing. He was imprisoned by administrative order of then-Minister Millicent Bagnold, countersigned by. He tilted his head, as if trying to remember something he knew very well. By you, as Chief Warlock. The dining room around them was ordinary and quiet and entirely oblivious. Dumbledore looked at Harry across the teacups, and his expression had shifted into something Harry hadn't seen before. Not quite the warm headmaster, not quite the charming explainer, something older and more careful and, Harry thought, slightly surprised. Like a man who had expected to talk to a child and was recalibrating. I made decisions in that period, Dumbledore said finally, that I believed were necessary. Sirius had access to your parents' location. The Fidelius, Peter Pettigrew, was the secret keeper. Harry said. Not Sirius. My parents changed at the last minute. He watched Dumbledore's face. That was in the vault, actually. In a letter my father sent you, asking to switch secret keepers, because he'd started to mistrust Pettigrew. He kept his eyes steady. Did you ever write back to that letter? The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Harry, Dumbledore said, and his voice was different now, quieter, the warmth stripped back to something rawer. I made mistakes. I am not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. In the chaos of that night, I made decisions based on incomplete information, and some of those decisions. He stopped. Some of them had consequences I did not foresee and would not have chosen. It was, Harry thought, the most honest thing Dumbledore had said since he'd walked through the fireplace. He held on to that. I appreciate you saying that, Harry said. Truly. He set down his cup. But the thing is, Professor, the Wisengamot hearing is still happening on Thursday. Because the things that went wrong haven't been corrected yet. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. Sirius Black is still in Azkaban without a trial. My parents' will is still sealed. The guardianship renewal still happened after it should have terminated. He paused. I'm not asking you to admit to anything in the hearing. I'm asking for those things to be fixed. The hearing is the mechanism for fixing them. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, You are very like your father. Hagrid said that too. Harry picked up his tea again. Was that a good thing, when my father did it? A very small pause. He was magnificent, Dumbledore said, and his voice for just a moment was entirely unguarded. Absolutely magnificent and absolutely infuriating, and one of the finest people I have ever known. Harry nodded. He looked down at his tea. Something was moving in his chest that he put carefully away. Come to the hearing, he said. Bring whatever you need to bring. Tell the truth, whatever truth you think is relevant. I promise I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to find out what happened to my family and make sure it's actually dealt with. He looked up. That's all. Dumbledore looked at him for another long moment. Then he stood, straightening his robes with the small, automatic gesture of a man gathering himself. Thursday, he said. I will be there. He walked to the fireplace and was gone in a flare of green before Harry had finished his tea. Harry looked across the room. Griphook didn't look up from his documents, but one hand moved briefly in the smallest of gestures, an acknowledgement. Harry drank his tea. Outside, the London drizzle had softened to something almost pleasant, the grey morning light coming through the leaky cauldron's small windows and catching the steam from his cup. 2 days until Thursday. 2 days until a room full of wizards had to answer questions they'd been avoiding for 10 years. He picked up his toast and started planning. Chapter 3. The Heir Speaks. Thursday arrived cold and bright, the kind of October morning that felt like the world had been scrubbed clean overnight. Harry stood outside the phone box entrance to the Ministry of Magic at 8:40, his audit folder under one arm, Griphook beside him with the satchel, and Hagrid looming behind both of them like a very anxious cliff face. You don't have to do this today, Hagrid said. For the 4th time since breakfast. I know, Harry said. For the 4th time since breakfast. We could, Dumbledore might be willing to just, if you talked to him more, privately, Hagrid. Harry looked up at him. We talked privately. It was very informative. Now we're doing this. He looked at the phone box. I'm not nervous. You don't need to be nervous on my behalf. I'm not nervous, I'm worried. Those read different. Are they? Hagrid thought about it. No, he admitted. Griphook opened the phone box door. We should go in. The session starts at 9. They went in. The ministry atrium was busier than it had been on Tuesday. The Wednesday lull had given way to the Thursday morning rush of an institution coming back to full speed after whatever the midweek slump of bureaucracy looked like. Witches and wizards moved in every direction, robes swishing on the marble, voices layered over each other in a drone that bounced off the high golden ceiling. Harry got his badge, Harry Potter, petitioner, and followed Griphook to the lifts. Several people looked at him on the way. He didn't look back. Level 10 was different from the rest of the ministry. Quieter. The corridor down to the courtrooms had the hushed, deliberate atmosphere of a place where serious things happened seriously, and the floor here was darker stone, worn smooth by decades of feet arriving to face judgment, or deliver it. The emergency session chamber was at the end of the corridor, marked by double doors that were already open. Harry walked in. The Wizengamot emergency session chamber was smaller than he'd imagined, not the grand circular amphitheater of the full court, but a high-ceilinged rectangular room with tiered benches along the walls and a central floor where the petitioner was meant to stand. About 20 witches and wizards in plum-colored robes occupied the benches. Not the full Wizengamot, which ran to hundreds of members, but the emergency panel, senior members, convened for exactly this kind of urgent petition. At the center of the high bench at the front of the room sat Augusta Longbottom. Harry had formed no particular picture of her in advance, which was sensible because the reality would have overwritten any picture immediately. She was a small woman in her 60s with a face that looked like it had been making binding decisions for so long that it had permanently taken on the quality of a verdict. Her hat had a stuffed vulture on it, which Harry found both alarming and, somehow, completely appropriate. She wore her plum robes with the air of someone who had worn them for 30 years and had not once found them anything other than entirely correct. She looked at Harry as he came through the doors and her expression said precisely nothing, which was more information than most people's expressions. Dumbledore was already there. He sat in the respondent's chair to the left of the chamber floor, not quite the dock, but close enough to carry the implication. He wore grey today, which Harry thought might be deliberate, and he looked at Harry when he entered with an expression that was difficult to read, which meant it was carefully managed. 2 other people were in the chamber whom Harry didn't recognize, a ministry official with a quick quotes quill poised above parchment, and a witch in solicitor's robes who was presumably there on behalf of the ministry's legal interest in the matter. Harry took his place at the petitioner's position in the center of the floor. Griphook stood at his shoulder. Hagrid, who was too large for any of the standard seating, had been given a spot near the door and was occupying it with the careful stillness of a man trying to take up less space than physics allowed. Augusta Longbottom looked at Harry. Then at Griphook. Then back at Harry. "Mr. Potter," she said. Her voice was precisely what her face suggested, clear, unhurried, and entirely accustomed to being the most important voice in the room. "You have filed a Provision 7 petition under the Orphaned Heirs Charter, with supporting documentation provided by Gringotts acting as independent estate representative. This session is convened to review that petition." She glanced at the parchment in front of her. "Before we begin formally, I have one question." "Yes, Madam Longbottom," Harry said. "How old are you?" 11, Harry said. "And 3 months." The vulture on her hat did not move. "Right," she said. "Let's begin." The first 30 minutes were procedural and Griphook handled most of them, presenting the audit documents, walking through the vault findings, laying the guardianship timeline in front of the panel with the efficient precision of someone who had organized the facts to make the conclusion unavoidable without ever stating the conclusion directly. This, Harry had come to understand, was the goblin's particular genius. He didn't argue. He presented, and he arranged what he presented so that the arrangement itself was the argument. The Wizengamot panel listened. They asked questions, several of them very pointed, from a sharp-faced warlock in the third row and a quiet witch at the end of the bench who turned out, Griphook had briefed Harry, to be the chair of the Estates and Inheritance Subcommittee. Griphook answered each question with documents already in hand, which had the subtle effect of making it clear that he had anticipated every question. Harry stood and watched and waited for his moment. It came when Madame Longbottom turned to Dumbledore. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, "the panel would like to hear your account of the August guardianship renewal. Specifically, your legal basis for renewing the guardianship after the primary account holder had already presented at Gringotts." Dumbledore looked at her. Harry had noticed, sat very still throughout Griphook's presentation, the stillness of a man choosing his battles, not the stillness of a man with nothing to say. He had prepared for this. The question was what he'd prepared. "Madame Longbottom," he said, "the renewal was made out of an abundance of caution." His voice was measured, calm, carrying the weight of a man who had survived several wars and a significant amount of difficult meetings. When Harry visited Gringotts in July, he was 11 years old and had been in the wizarding world for less than a day. The estate charter does specify that first presentation at Gringotts triggers the termination of minor guardianship, but the charter also allows for an exception where the account holder is deemed unprepared to manage significant holdings independently. He paused. "The Potter family vault represents a considerable estate. I renewed the guardianship in August to ensure continuity of management, while Harry was beginning his education." It was, Harry thought, genuinely well-reasoned. If you didn't look too closely at the mechanics, it sounded like responsible caution. "The exception you're citing," Harry said, "requires a formal petition to the Wisengamot, a psychological assessment of the account holder's capacity, and approval by a 3-member panel of Gringotts senior staff." He looked at Dumbledore. "Was that process followed?" Silence. "Mr. Potter," Madame Longbottom said, not unkindly, "questions are directed through the chair." "My apologies, madam." Harry looked at her. "Through the chair, was the formal exception process followed prior to the August renewal?" Longbottom looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "It was not. Given the urgency of the timing, I made the decision unilaterally and expected to formalize it through Gringotts in due course. The renewal was made 16 days after Mr. Potter's Gringotts visit," Griphook said from Harry's shoulder, not loudly, simply adding the number to the room. "Sufficient time for the formal process to have been initiated, had it been intended." Several members of the panel wrote something down. Madame Longbottom moved to the next item with the efficiency of someone who had noted the point and intended to return to it. The matter of the Potter family will. The room's atmosphere shifted. Harry felt it, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quality of the stillness that followed those 8 words. The will was the thing that everyone had been waiting for. Dumbledore sat very straight. "The will was sealed," Longbottom said, "under a national security provision, signed by you as Chief Warlock in November 1981. The sealing order is in the petition documentation." She looked at him. "Can you speak to the necessity of that order?" "At the time," Dumbledore said, "Voldemort's defeat had created instability. The will's contents named specific individuals in sensitive positions. Their naming in a public document could have. The will was filed with Gringotts and the Wisengamot," Harry said, and then caught himself. "Through the chair, the will was filed with both institutions, which is standard practice, and the filing was sealed rather than simply restricted. The restriction process would have allowed relevant parties, guardians, estate representatives, to access the document while preventing public circulation." He paused. "Can Professor Dumbledore explain why the more restrictive sealing was chosen over the standard restriction process?" The quiet witch at the end of the bench, the Inheritance Subcommittee chair, leaned forward slightly. Harry had noted her as an ally before the session began, based on nothing more concrete than the way she'd read Griphook's documents, thoroughly, twice, with the look of someone building a case. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite frustration, not quite admiration, some precise mixture of both. "The sealing was chosen," he said carefully, "because the will's designated primary guardian, Sirius Black, had been identified as an immediate threat to the public. Before his trial, Harry said. Through the chair, Madame Longbottom said, but her voice was mild now. Through the chair, Harry agreed. Had Sirius Black been tried and convicted, the will's guardian designation would have become legally void, and the estate would have passed to the secondary guardians as specified, Remus Lupin, or the Longbottom family. He looked at the panel. The sealing of the will and the absence of a trial for Sirius Black meant that neither thing was dealt with properly. The estate guardianship instead fell to Professor Dumbledore, who, he paused, just briefly, was also the person who countersigned Black's imprisonment order. The room was very quiet. It wasn't an accusation. He hadn't accused anyone of anything. He'd laid 4 facts in sequence, and let the panel follow the line between them, which was considerably more powerful than an accusation, because facts arranged carefully couldn't be dismissed as emotion. The sharp-faced warlock in the third row said, in a voice that suggested he had been waiting impatiently, "Deputy Longbottom, I'd like to formally raise the question of Sirius Black's legal standing." "It's already on the agenda," Longbottom said calmly. "We'll reach it." They reached it 12 minutes later, after Griphook presented the Ministry's own records, the criminal file on Sirius Black, which Harry had requested on Tuesday and which had arrived by owl on Wednesday evening, and which contained, very clearly, no record of a trial date, no record of a conviction hearing, no record of a Wisengamot proceeding of any kind. Just the administrative imprisonment order. Signed by Millicent Bagnold. Countersigned by Dumbledore. "It is the position of Gringotts," Griphook said, in the tone of someone reading a weather forecast, "that the estate of the petitioner, Harry James Potter, has a material interest in the legal status of Sirius Orion Black, as the deceased parents will designate Black as primary guardian. The current legal resolution of Black's case directly impacts the estate's succession and guardian designation. Gringotts therefore requests that the Wisengamot initiate a formal review of Black's imprisonment status, including the question of whether he is entitled to a hearing." Madame Longbottom looked at the panel. The sharp-faced warlock said, "The records speak for themselves. The man has been in Azkaban for 10 years without a trial. If he were a goblin or a muggle, we'd have international incidents over this." Nobody disagreed. Nobody disagreed out loud, anyway. Harry watched the panel carefully. There were 3 or 4 members whose faces suggested private discomfort, the look of people who knew that something had been allowed to continue because it was inconvenient to stop it, and who were now being required to register that knowledge in a formal setting. It was not a comfortable look, but it was not, he thought, a hostile one. Fudge arrived 17 minutes into the proceedings. Harry had been wondering when he'd appear. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic. A round, fussy-looking man in a pinstripe suit and lime-green bowler hat who came through the chamber doors with the energy of someone who had been told about a problem and had come personally to manage it, which was absolutely the wrong approach for this particular problem. He looked at the chamber, at Longbottom, at Dumbledore, at Harry, in that order, and his expression went through several distinct stages. "Augusta," he said, which was a mistake, using her first name like that. "Minister," she said in a tone that could have frozen the Thames. "This is an active session." "Yes, I was made aware of the nature of this session this morning, and I felt it necessary. You are welcome to observe," she said. From the gallery. A pause that made the word gallery do quite a lot of work. "We are currently reviewing the legal status of Sirius Black's imprisonment." Fudge's face went through 2 more stages. "That is a complex matter, and I don't think a session of this nature is the appropriate venue," said the Inheritance Subcommittee, which, in a voice that was sweet in the way that something sharp can be sweet right before you realize it's cut you. "For determining whether a man is in prison lawfully is a court of law. Which is what this is." She looked at Fudge pleasantly. "Please sit, Minister. We're almost at the interval." Fudge sat. Harry looked at the floor to avoid catching Griphook's eye, because Griphook was radiating the goblin equivalent of satisfaction, and Harry did not want to smile in the middle of a Wisengamot session. The interval was 20 minutes, long enough for the panel to review documents, for the ministry solicitor to confer with someone in the corridor, and for Fudge to attempt 3 separate conversations that various people declined with varying degrees of grace. Harry stood by the far wall and ate a sandwich that Hagrid pressed on him from apparently nowhere, because Hagrid had, apparently, brought sandwiches to a Wisengamot hearing, which was the most Hagrid thing that had ever happened. "How do you think it's going?" Hagrid asked quietly. "Well," Harry said between bites. "Dumbledore he looks fine. He's fine." Harry looked across the room to where Dumbledore stood in quiet conversation with Madame Longbottom, their heads inclined toward each other, and thought about what that conversation contained. He thought it was probably honest, or as close to honest as the circumstances allowed. Dumbledore wasn't stupid. He knew what the documents showed. The question was what he was willing to do about it. "He's deciding how much to give them," Harry said. "Meaning?" "Meaning he knows that some of this is going to happen regardless. The Black Trial, that's going to happen. There's no way to stop it, the records are too clear. The will unsealing, same thing. The question is whether he gets ahead of it or gets dragged into it." Harry finished the sandwich. "He's smart enough to get ahead of it." Hagrid looked worried. "And is that good or bad for you?" Harry thought about it. "Good, mostly. If he cooperates with the process, things move faster, and the thing I actually care about is getting answers, not punishing anyone." He looked at Hagrid. "The only thing I care about that might be complicated is if he argues the circumstances of my placement with the Dursleys. Because the will is very specific, I was not supposed to go there." "He'll have a reason," Hagrid said, and there was something in his voice, something quiet and careful, that made Harry look at him more directly. "Hagrid, do you know why he sent me there?" Hagrid was very still for a moment. Then, "Blood protection," he said quietly. "Lily, your mom, when she died fair, yeah, it created something. A protection. And it worked through blood, her blood, which ran in your aunt as well. As long as you could call your aunt's house home, that protection held." He looked at the floor. "Dumbledore told me that, when I asked him, years ago. I asked him if there'd been other options." Harry looked at him. "And were there?" "He said the blood protection was too important. That your safety had to come first." "My safety?" Harry said. He let that sit for a moment. "I slept in a cupboard." "I know. For 10 years. Harry, I'm not blaming you." Harry put the sandwich wrapper in his pocket. "I just want it to be said clearly. The protection that was supposed to keep me safe required that I be miserable and isolated and uninformed for a decade. And the person who made that decision is also the person who managed my estate, sealed my parents' will, and countersigned the imprisonment of the guardian my parents chose." He was very quiet. "I understand that he thought he was protecting me. I understand that it's complicated. But complicated isn't the same as right." Hagrid had the look he'd had at the vault, that expression of someone encountering something unexpected in someone they'd expected to understand fully. "No," he said softly. "No, it's not." The chamber doors opened. Madame Longbottom reconvened the session with a single tap of her gavel, not the theatrical 3-knock of American legal drama, just one precise tap that meant we are done with the interval, we are not taking questions about the interval. "Before we proceed," she said, "I want to place on record that during the interval, Professor Dumbledore approached the bench and indicated his willingness to cooperate fully with any proceedings that follow from today's session, including the unsealing of the Potter will and the formal review of Sirius Black's imprisonment status." Harry looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore met his eyes. His expression was complicated. It was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he was at peace with even if he hadn't chosen it freely. He inclined his head very slightly. Harry nodded back. "The panel is therefore prepared to issue the following preliminary orders," Longbottom continued, reading from a parchment in front of her. "First, the Potter family estate guardianship renewal of August 1991 is hereby suspended pending full review. No transactions may be made against Potter Family Vault 412 or affiliated holdings until the review is complete. She turned a page. Second, the sealing order on the Potter family will, dated November 1981, is hereby revoked. The will is to be unsealed and copies provided to all legally interested parties within 48 hours. Several panel members wrote. Fudge, in the gallery, had gone the color of old paste. Third, the criminal file of Sirius Orion Black is referred to the full Weisengemot for emergency review of his imprisonment status. A preliminary hearing to determine whether a trial is warranted is to be scheduled within 7 days. She looked up. We are also referring a formal inquiry to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding the original imprisonment order. The sharp-faced warlock in the third row leaned forward. And the estate, in the interim, who is designated as acting guardian for the purposes of account management. Longbottom looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, you have made no nomination for an acting guardian. Do you wish to make one? Harry had thought about this. He'd thought about it on Tuesday night, and Wednesday night, and again this morning over breakfast. The answer he'd arrived at was the one he stayed with. I'd like to propose that Gringotts retains estate management authority for the interim period, he said, rather than appointing a personal guardian. He paused. I'll be at school. My daily needs are covered. The estate just needs to be properly administered until the will is formally processed and a legal guardian designated through the appropriate process. Longbottom looked at Griphook. Does Gringotts accept? Gringotts accepts, Griphook said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Fudge made a sound in the gallery that was somewhere between a cough and a protest. Longbottom looked at him once, briefly, and he subsided. Very well. She turned to the full panel. Are there objections to the preliminary orders as stated? There was a murmuring. A few questions, answered efficiently by the solicitor and by Griphook in sequence. No objections were formally raised, though 2 panel members asked for their discomfort regarding the black referral to be noted in the record, which Longbottom noted with the expression of someone noting which way the wind was blowing for future reference. The orders are issued, she said. This session is adjourned. She gathered her documents, and then, just before she stood, she looked at Harry one more time. Mr. Potter, she said. Madam Longbottom. My grandson starts at Hogwarts this year. He's on the train already. A pause. I believe you'll be starting late. A few weeks. Harry agreed. Neville is a good boy. Something shifted very slightly in her formidable expression. He could use a friend who isn't impressed by things that don't deserve to be impressive. Harry looked at her. I'll look forward to meeting him. The vulture on her hat did not move, but Harry had the distinct impression, as she stood and left the chamber, that she was satisfied. They came out into the ministry atrium with preliminary orders in hand and Fudge bearing down on them from the direction of the lifts with the speed of a man whose morning had gone significantly wrong. He was flanked by a sharp-jawed woman in aura robes who Harry presumed was some variety of personal security, and a pale young man in ministry robes who was scribbling on a clipboard and trying to keep up with Fudge's pace simultaneously. Harry, Fudge said, arriving in front of them with a smile that had been assembled in a hurry and didn't quite sit flat. My boy, Minister Fudge, Harry said. Not sir. Not hello. Just his name and title, direct and level. Fudge's smile reset slightly. He was used to a different response. Awe maybe, or the eager deference of a famous name encountering official authority. He looked at Harry the way people looked at something that wasn't following the script they'd prepared. I wanted to personally assure you that the ministry takes your concerns very seriously, and we're going to look into all of this very carefully. These things can often be explained by, the preliminary orders have been issued, Harry said. Gringotts will be managing the estate. The will unsealing and the black review are proceeding through the appropriate channels. He looked at Fudge pleasantly. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Minister? Fudge blinked. He had, Harry thought, prepared a version of this conversation in which he was reassuring a bewildered child. He had not prepared a version in which the bewildered child didn't exist. Aye, well. The black matter is, politically speaking, it requires some delicacy. Sirius Black was considered a very dangerous, without a trial, Harry said. The evidence at the time, what evidence? Harry asked. Through appropriate channels, I mean. The Ministry's own file contains no evidence of record. Just the imprisonment order. He tilted his head. If there's evidence, I'd genuinely like to know about it. That would be very useful for the Wisengamot Review. Fudge's pale aide had stopped scribbling and was looking at Harry with an expression of such concentrated attention that Harry suspected he was going to be reading a very interesting memo later today. We'll have someone look into that, Fudge said, in the tone of a man who was going to have someone look into that, and was going to very much not like what they found. In the meantime, I do want to say, Harry, that the Ministry is committed to your well-being. If there's anything we can do, there are a few things, Harry said. The will unsealing, 48 hours per the order. If there's any difficulty with that timeline, I'd appreciate being notified. He paused. And the Black hearing, 7 days for the preliminary. I'll be at Hogwarts by then, but Griphook will be there as my estate representative. He looked at Fudge steadily. Gringotts takes punctuality seriously. Fudge looked at Griphook. Griphook looked back at Fudge with the expression of someone who had outlasted every ministry of magic in the last 300 years and fully expected to outlast this one. Of course, Fudge said. Of course, yes. Well. He adjusted his bowler hat. Do send word if you need anything. I will, Harry said. Thank you, Minister. Fudge left. Hagrid, who had been standing very carefully still through this entire exchange, let out a breath that could probably be heard on level 3. Blimey, he said softly. He's not a bad man, Harry said, watching Fudge disappear into a crowd of Ministry workers. He's just more interested in things being calm than things being right. Those aren't always the same. He picked up his folder. Come on. We have one more thing to do today. Remus Lupin was already at the Leaky Cauldron when they arrived in the early afternoon, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold, wearing robes that were clean but worn at the elbows, his hands wrapped around the cup in the way of someone who needed something to hold on to. He looked up when Harry came through the door. Harry looked back. He'd expected to feel something large and dramatic when he finally met someone who had actually known his parents, some rush of emotion, some cinematic moment of recognition. What he actually felt was quieter than that. Remus Lupin had his mother's letters' quality of being honest in a way that was slightly too unguarded to be comfortable. He looked tired and careful, and, when he saw Harry, like something in him had been braced for a very long time and had suddenly, slightly, let go. You look like James, Lupin said. But your eyes are hers, Harry said. I know. Hagrid told me. He sat down. Thank you for coming. I should have. Lupin stopped. Tried again. I should have found you years ago. I had reasons for not. Some of them were real reasons, some of them were cowardice. I'm sorry. Harry looked at him. He had, in the last 4 days, developed a considerable tolerance for complicated apologies from people who had not done right by him but were not, fundamentally, bad people. He'd put most of his anger about that in the same folder as everything else, labeled Deal with Later, and had left it closed. Tell me about my parents, he said instead. Not the war stuff, I'll get to that. Just, what were they like? Lupin looked at him for a moment, and then something in his face softened in a way that changed it completely. He wrapped his hands around his cold tea and started talking. He talked for over an hour. He talked about James Potter tripping over his own feet when he was nervous, which was always the first 2 years of Hogwarts, until he found his stride and became suddenly and inexplicably confident. He talked about Lily Evans arriving as a Muggle-born with more natural ability than half the class and the absolute serene composure of someone who had decided she was allowed to be exactly what she was and nobody's opinion would change that. He talked about the way James would do anything for a laugh that was genuinely funny and the way Lily would inform him, with surgical precision, that something was not funny, and the way James would argue until he was wrong, and then be completely unashamed about having been wrong. He talked about their kitchen in Godric's Hollow, which he'd visited twice before they went into hiding, and the particular sound of Harry as a baby laughing, which he described as sounding like someone had invented a new, better kind of sound. Harry sat and listened to all of it and filed it in a completely different folder, not the one marked Deal with Later, but a new one he hadn't had before, marked with no label at all. Serious, Harry said when Lupin paused. Lupin's hands tightened on his cup. Serious. What do you actually believe happened that night? Lupin was quiet for a long moment. I believed, for years, I believed what everyone else believed. What we were meant to believe. That he'd betrayed them. He looked at Harry. But there were things that never sat right. Sirius would have died for James. Would have, without blinking, died. And Peter was always the uncertain one. The one who followed rather than led. The one who was frightened. He stopped. The morning they found the scene, 12 dead muggles, a piece of finger, they assumed Sirius had done the killing and Peter had died trying to stop him. But Peter was a registered animagus, untrained, supposedly, except I always knew he'd practiced. Practiced the animagus transformation in school, unregistered. He looked at Harry steadily. A man who can become a rat and is terrified for his life and has every reason to vanish, doesn't leave much of himself behind, Harry said. No. Is there anyone at the Ministry who'd listen to this? There is now, Lupin said quietly, with the very faint look of someone who had read this morning's Daily Prophet, which had, predictably, run a headline about the Wisengamot session that was somewhere between breathless and apoplectic. The things you did this week, Harry, the hearing, the orders, I need Sirius to have a trial, Harry said. A real one, with evidence, with witnesses. If he's guilty, then he's guilty and that's a different conversation. But if he's not, Lupin said, then the person who actually betrayed your parents is somewhere out there. His voice was very quiet. And that matters for reasons beyond Sirius. Harry nodded. I know. They looked at each other across the table, and Harry thought about the fact that this man, tired, worn at the elbows, who had apparently spent a decade being too frightened to look for the boy who should have been in his life, was in a certain sense the only living connection he had to who his parents actually were. Not what they'd died for, not what they'd symbolized, not the legend. The people. Come to Hogwarts, Harry said. When I go, in a couple of weeks. Come and visit. He paused. I'd like to keep talking. Lupin looked at him. For a moment his expression went through something complicated and private and then settled into something simpler. Yes, he said. I'd like that. The Potter will was unsealed at noon the following day. Griphook brought Harry a copy, not the summary he'd already read in the vault, but the full document, several pages of formal legal parchment, notarized and sealed in goblin gold ink, the contents of which were exactly what the summary had described but somehow entirely different in the full version. The full version had voices in it. Not literally, it was parchment, not a recording, but the way something is written tells you things about the person writing it. The legal language was the solicitor's, formal and precise. But the instructions, the annotations, the small parenthetical notes that dotted the document, those were James and Lily's. We leave Harry our love and our hope and the absolute conviction that he will be magnificent. Not in legal language. In a parenthetical, at the bottom of the second page, in two different handwritings, one bold and looping, one neat and certain. Harry sat with the document in his room at the Leaky Cauldron and read it twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in the unlabeled folder. He had one more thing to do before he could think about school. He sat at the desk and wrote a letter, not to Dumbledore this time, not to the Ministry, not to anyone official. To the Records Department at Azkaban, formally requesting, in his capacity as primary interested party in the Sirius Black Wisengamot Review, confirmation of Black's current health status and confirmation that the formal review notification had been received. Then he wrote a second letter. To Sirius Black, in the hope that it reaches you, in the hope that you are still someone who can receive letters and understand them. I got your guardianship confirmed in the will. I got the will unsealed. The Wiesendamat is reviewing your imprisonment status. Preliminary hearing in 7 days. I don't know if you're innocent. I think the question needs to be asked properly. I'm asking it. The letter I wrote you a few days ago, I don't know if it got through. If it did, ignore the uncertainty in it. I've done the research now. I'm not uncertain anymore. Hold on. Harry Potter, he sealed it. He gave it to Hedwig and told her it was the most important letter she'd ever carried. She stepped off the windowsill into the afternoon light like she already knew. 2 days later, Harry Potter packed his trunk, said goodbye to a leaky cauldron that had been his home for a week, shook Tom's hand firmly enough to make the old barman blink, and stood in Diagon Alley in the autumn sunshine with Griphook on his left, and Hagrid on his right, and his owl on his shoulder, and his family's documents in a satchel on his back. The ministry had confirmed the black preliminary hearing for the following Wednesday. The estate guardianship renewal was suspended. The will was unsealed and copies had gone to every legally interested party. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement had, quietly and without fanfare, begun asking questions about Peter Pettigrew's case file, which was either because someone had developed a conscience or because Griphook had mentioned the anomaly in the deceased accounts and someone in records had flagged it, and either way the question was now in the system and questions in the system had a way of eventually being answered. Harry looked at the alley. The sunlight caught the gold trim of Gringotts at the far end. A witch walked by with a basket of potion ingredients. 2 small children ran past arguing about something that was probably inconsequential and completely important to them. Ready? Hagrid said. Yes, Harry said. Hogwarts then. Hogwarts, Harry agreed. And then, because he thought it needed to be said, thank you, Hagrid, for staying. For not trying to talk me out of it. Hagrid made a sound that was absolutely not crying. Your mum would have been so proud, he said, in a very rough voice. And your dad, blimey, your dad would have been insufferable about it. In the best way. Harry grinned. It was the first proper grin he'd allowed himself all week, and it felt like unclenching something that had been held tight for a very long time. Let's go, he said. They walked to the apparition point together, Hagrid, Harry, and Griphook, and the London morning carried them forward into what came next. Chapter 4. The school on his terms. Hogwarts, as it turned out, was exactly as ridiculous and magnificent as Harry had imagined. The boat ride across the lake happened at dusk, not because Harry had arrived on September 1st with the other first years, but because Hagrid, who apparently ran the boats regardless of scheduling, had insisted that Harry deserved the proper introduction, and had therefore organized a private crossing on a Wednesday evening in mid-October with the particular determination of a man who had decided this was happening and physics could sort itself out. There were 3 boats, because of Hagrid and because of Harry's trunk and because Griphook had declined, with great dignity, to share a vessel with anyone. The castle came out of the dark the way things only came out of the dark when they'd been there for 1,000 years, slowly, inevitably, like it was the landscape that was moving toward you rather than the other way around. Towers first, then walls, then the whole improbable pile of it reflected in the black surface of the lake, lit from within by the warm ember of 1,000 windows. Harry looked at it for a long time. Well, he said. Yeah, Hagrid agreed, from his boat, with the quiet satisfaction of a man showing someone something he loved. Griphook, from the 3rd boat, said nothing. But Harry noticed he was looking at the castle with an expression that wasn't his usual professional neutrality. Something older than that, something complicated, the expression of a species that had built things like this before humans had learned to write things down, and still sometimes needed to look at what had been made with it. The boats touched shore. They climbed the bank. Hagrid knocked on the castle's great oak doors with a fist the size of a small dining table. Professor McGonagall opened them. She looked at Harry. She looked at Hagrid. She looked at Griphook with an expression that processed the sight of a Gringotts goblin arriving at Hogwarts at 7 in the evening with a resigned precision that suggested she had read the Wisengamot correspondence and had spent the last 2 weeks preparing herself. "Mr. Potter," she said, "welcome to Hogwarts. You are 3 weeks late." "I know," Harry said. "I'm sorry about that. There were some things that needed sorting. So I understand." Her eyes were sharp and careful and not, Harry thought, unfriendly. Something in her was assessing him the way Augusta Longbottom had assessed him, and he had the same sense of being weighed by someone whose scales were accurate. "Professor Dumbledore has briefed the staff. Your situation is—" A very brief pause. "Understood." "Good," Harry said. "I appreciate it." She looked at Griphook. "You'll be wanting quarters." Gringotts' correspondence indicated a suite near the east wing, which has the appropriate. The correspondence was accurate. Griphook said. "Thank you, Professor." McGonagall looked between them. Harry thought she might be recalibrating something. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, then. Both of you." "Hagrid, I'll get the trunk," Hagrid said, which was clearly code for "I will take a moment to compose myself because this is a lot," and McGonagall accepted it with the grace of a woman who had known Hagrid for a very long time. Harry stepped over the threshold of Hogwarts for the first time and felt, what? Not magic, exactly, though the air was different here, denser and more alive. Not awe, though the entrance hall was high enough to lose the ceiling in shadow. Something more personal than either. Something that felt, despite everything, like arriving. The sorting happened at 8:15, in front of the entire school. McGonagall had explained it on the walk to the Great Hall: the hat, the stool, the houses. Harry had read about it in Hogwarts, a history, which he'd bought in Diagon Alley and finished in 2 days, so none of the mechanics were surprising. What was surprising was the walk through the Great Hall doors. 400 students looked up from their dinners. The noise dropped in stages, table by table, the hush moving outward from the door like a stone dropped in still water. By the time Harry had taken 10 steps into the hall, it was completely silent. He'd known his name was famous. He'd been told, repeatedly, in various ways, that people knew who he was. He'd even believed it, intellectually. He had not, until this moment, felt it, the physical reality of a room full of people who had grown up with a story and were now looking at the person in the story and finding him unexpectedly real. He walked to the front of the hall without hurrying. McGonagall placed the sorting hat on his head before he'd even fully sat down, because she had the look of someone who wanted to move this along before it became more of an occasion than it already was. The hat dropped over his eyes and the world became the inside of a very old, very specific darkness. "Well," said a voice in his ear, dry and interested. "Now here's the thing." "Hello," Harry thought back. "You're late." Not accusatory, curious, like it had been watching a developing situation from a distance, and was now finally getting the close view. "I sorted your year 3 weeks ago. I've been wondering when you'd arrive. Were you expecting something specific?" "I'm always expecting something specific." A pause, like the hat was moving through his thoughts. "You have your father's courage and your mother's precision, and something that belongs entirely to yourself." Another pause. "Someone has been trying, I think, to decide your path before you could choose it." "You seem to have had thoughts about that." "A few," Harry agreed. "Yes." The hat was quiet for a moment. "You'd do well in any house, truthfully. Your ambition would serve Slytherin. Your mind would thrive in Ravenclaw. Your loyalty is deeper than you know, Hufflepuff would value it." A pause. "But what I actually see, at the core of everything you've done this week, is nerve. Not recklessness. The kind of courage that reads the fine print and then acts anyway." The voice took on something that was almost warm. "I know exactly where to put you." "Gryffindor!" the hat shouted. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry took the hat off and handed it back to McGonagall, who took it with a very small expression that might have been satisfaction and walked him to the Gryffindor table, where students were making room with the barely contained enthusiasm of people who had been waiting 3 weeks for this specific moment. He sat down. A red-haired boy immediately extended his hand. Ron Weasley. We were on the train together. Well, you weren't, but I was. The whole school's been talking about you. It's brilliant that you're finally Harry Potter. Nice to meet you. Harry shook his hand. I know who you are, Ron said, and then laughed at himself. Obviously. Sorry. My mum was saying you'd probably end up in Slytherin because of the… He stopped. Never mind what my mum said. She's worried about the estate dispute, Harry said. Not unkindly, just directly. A lot of people who trust Dumbledore are worried about it. That's understandable. Ron stared at him. How did you? Because if I were a Weasley and I trusted Dumbledore, I'd be worried about it too. Harry reached for the food that had reappeared, dinner resuming now that the hall was settling back into its normal rhythm, and served himself some potatoes. What are the classes like? Ron, visibly recalibrating, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a direct route past the awkward part. Charms is brilliant, Flitwick's really good. Transfiguration's hard but McGonagall's fair. Herbology's all right. History of magic is… He made a face. Binns literally died and didn't notice, he just kept teaching. A ghost teaches history of magic? Teaches is generous, said a voice from Harry's right. He turned. Hermione Granger was sitting 2 seats away, between Harry and a larger boy who was watching the whole exchange with wide, anxious eyes. She had a book open beside her plate, not reading it right now, but positioned as if she'd like to be. Her hair was large and curly, and she looked at Harry with the specific expression of someone who had decided to form their own opinion rather than adopt the one the room was currently circulating. Professor Binns died in the staff room and simply got up the next morning and drifted to class, she said. He's never noticed the difference. The class involves copying his notes verbatim. I've read a history of magic through twice and I learn more in an hour of independent reading than in a week of his lectures. Same book, Harry said. Finished it in Diagon Alley. She looked at him with a different quality of attention. All of it? The appendices took a bit longer. What did you think about the section on the founders? Something lit up in her face. The bit about Slytherin's departure being voluntary rather than the forced exile the later sources claim? Yes, I thought that was… She stopped herself. Looked faintly surprised at herself. Sorry. People don't usually want to talk about the appendices. They're the best bit, Harry said. The main text is always written for the person who already agrees with it. The appendices are where the actual arguments are. Hermione looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the book. The large boy on her other side said, I'm Neville. Neville Longbottom. His voice was careful, the way voices were careful when they were used to being overlooked. My Gran mentioned you. She said good things? I hoped she would, Harry said. She was impressive. Neville blinked. You met her? At the Wiesengemot. She ran the session. He looked at Neville steadily. She clearly cares very much about things being done properly. You must get something from her. Neville looked like nobody had ever said something like that to him before. He didn't quite know where to put it, so he put it on his face, which went quiet and a little pleased and very uncertain. Harry handed him the bread rolls without being asked, because Neville had been reaching for them and had stopped reaching when he started talking, in the particular automatic way of someone who was used to stepping back. Neville took the rolls and something in his shoulders settled. Defense Against the Dark Arts was first thing Thursday morning. Harry had read the textbook cover to cover during his week at the Leaky Cauldron, The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Protection, and had found it thorough on theory and almost entirely useless on practice, which he suspected was deliberate. Theory without practice was information you couldn't use, which kept the information safely academic. He arrived at the classroom 3 minutes early and took a seat near the middle, not the front, which was Hermione's territory and she'd earned it, but not the back, where Ron and another boy named Dean Thomas were already throwing things at each other in the relaxed way of people who'd had 3 weeks to settle into their dynamic. The classroom was a strange room. Defense classrooms often were, he'd read. There was something about the subject that attracted the addition of personal touches, specimens in jars and weapons on walls, and the occasional dark artifact kept for educational purposes behind glass. Professor Quirrell's classroom had purple turbaned silhouettes on the curtains, and the smell of garlic so pervasive that Neville, when he came in, immediately looked like he might sneeze until he got used to it. Quirrell came in slightly after the students, which Harry noted. He was a slight man, younger than Harry had expected, with a turban wound tight around his head and the specific social discomfort of someone who had difficulty being the most visible person in a room. He moved to the front of the class with a stutter-stepped walk and arranged his notes with hands that weren't quite steady. "Gee, good morning," he said. "Welcome to Defense Against the Dark Arts. I am Professor Quirrell." He began talking about defensive theory, and Harry listened carefully, not to what Quirrell was saying, which was good but not particularly difficult, but to how he was saying it. The stutter was inconsistent. That was the interesting thing. Not every word, not every sentence, just some of them, and the ones it appeared on didn't follow any obvious pattern. Fear-based stutters had patterns. Effort-based stutters had patterns. This one moved around in a way that seemed almost selected. Harry watched Quirrell the way he'd watched Hagrid on the platform and the way he'd watched Fudge in the Ministry atrium. During a question-and-answer segment halfway through the lesson, he raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Potter?" In the section on shielding charms, the textbook distinguishes between physical and magical barriers, but doesn't cover the interaction between them. I was wondering what the established protocol is for casting both simultaneously. Is there a sequencing recommendation, or does it depend on the specific threat? Quirrell looked at him. For just a fraction of a second, one brief, precise moment, his eyes were completely steady and entirely focused, and then the slight, anxious, stuttering persona came back down over them like a curtain. "An excellent Q question. The sequencing generally depends on." Harry watched the curtain. He noted when it slipped, which it did twice more during the class, once when a student used the word Voldemort, and once when Quirrell himself referenced it. Both times the steadiness came for just a moment before the flinching resumed. He didn't say anything about it. He filed it in the folder marked "Deal with Later" and answered the rest of his questions correctly, and was out of the classroom before the bell fully rang. Potions was worse. Not the subject. He actually liked the subject, found the precision of it satisfying in the same way that Griphook's document organization was satisfying, the way a thing that required exact measurement was more honest than a thing that allowed approximation. He liked potions. He did not, as it turned out, particularly enjoy the way it was taught. Snape arrived in the dungeon classroom the way Weather arrived, preceding himself, his robes moving, the room cooling slightly in his wake. He had a face that had been unhappy for a long time and had begun to take it personally. Harry had read about him in advance. Hagrid had mentioned him, McGonagall had warned that he was demanding, Ron had simply made a face, and had formed no particular opinion, which he maintained for approximately the first 5 minutes of the lesson. Then Snape began the roll call. He moved through the names with a sharp efficiency, marking each with the precision of someone who found precision satisfying in ways that were specifically about power. When he reached Harry's name, he stopped. "Ah," he said. "Harry Potter." The emphasis was delicate and deliberate. "Our famous late arrival." "Professor," Harry said. "Tell me, Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" First day. Sitting down. Cold start, no preamble, demonstrably designed to catch out a student who hadn't had 3 weeks of lessons. Around him, Harry heard the small sounds of other students shifting nervously. "Draught of living death," Harry said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Asphodel is in the Amaryllis family, and the powdered root acts as the binding agent for the wormwood's active sedative compounds. The exact ratio matters. Too much asphodel, and the emulsification fails, too little and the draft's duration drops significantly." Silence. Snape looked at him. His expression had not changed precisely, but something behind it had shifted by the smallest possible degree. "Where would you look?" he continued in the same tone. "If I asked you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat. They're effective general antidotes for most potions, not all, and not for the most complex compounds, but useful enough that I understand why they're recommended as a first response measure." "And what," Snape said, "is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "Nothing. Same plant. The name changes regionally and with context. Wolfsbane in potions literature because of its historical use in werewolf lore, monkshood in herbology because of its flower shape, aconite in the older texts and in some apothecary catalogues." Harry paused. "Poisonous in every formulation unless properly processed." The dungeon was very quiet. Snape looked at him for a long moment. His expression was not admiring. It was, Harry thought, the expression of a man who had prepared a performance and found that the audience was not reacting in the planned direction. He had expected to demonstrate the ignorance of the famous boy, and the famous boy had read the textbooks. "Clearly," Snape said finally, his voice smooth and cool, "Mr. Potter has been using his extended absence from school productively." The tone made productively sound like something slightly suspicious. Whether that translates into any actual competence remains to be seen. "I'm looking forward to finding out," Harry said, mildly. Like it was a genuine response to a genuine observation, not an acknowledgement of the subtext, which was so thick you could have bottled it. Snape moved on. Ron, beside him, leaned 3 millimeters in Harry's direction. "Blimey," he breathed. Harry started writing notes. The lesson itself was fine. They were brewing a simple calming draught, first-year standard, the kind of thing Harry had read about enough that the mechanics were familiar even though he'd never actually held a cauldron before. He worked carefully, measured precisely, and spent more time watching the other students than watching his own cauldron because he'd realized 20 minutes in that he'd be fine, and it was more instructive to observe the differences in how people approached the task. Neville was 2 stations down, hunched over his cauldron with the look of a person who was certain something was about to go wrong and was trying to prepare for it. His hands were steady, actually, steadier than he thought they were, but the anticipatory flinch kept interrupting him before he could finish a motion cleanly. Harry waited until Snape's back was turned and then said quietly, "Add the ginger root before the rotation, not after. The rotation should integrate it, not compete with it." Neville looked at him with the wide-eyed expression of someone receiving unexpected rescue. He added the ginger root first. The potion shifted from muddy brown to the clear amber it was supposed to be. Snape came by their station at the end of the lesson, examined Harry's cauldron, and said nothing, which Harry understood to mean it was correct. He examined Neville's cauldron with the look of someone who had expected to find something else and found it slightly inconvenient that he couldn't. Neville was quiet as they packed up, and then said in a low voice, "Thank you." He stopped. "He usually what?" "He's hard on me. More than the others." Neville didn't say it was self-pity, just with the flat accuracy of someone stating a documented fact. "I'm not very good." "Your hands are steadier than you think they are," Harry said. "You interrupted 3 of your own movements today because you were expecting to fail them. The technique is fine. The anticipation's the problem." Neville stared at him. "We can practice," Harry said. "Whenever you want. I've got a Goblin Estate representative in the East Wing who will absolutely use any cauldron we forget to clean as grounds for filing a complaint, so we'll be motivated." Neville laughed, short, surprised, real. "Okay," he said. "Yeah. Okay." It was during lunch on the second day that Draco Malfoy made his approach. Harry had been expecting it. He'd read enough, asked enough quiet questions in the Gryffindor common room, to understand the social geography of Hogwarts in broad strokes, and Draco Malfoy occupied a specific position on that map, Slytherin, Lucius Malfoy's son, from a family that had navigated the post-Voldemort landscape with more flexibility than principle. He'd also heard that the Malfoys and the Potters were connected in specific ways. The The sort of connection that came from both families being old and significant and from moving in the same circles for enough generations that the connection became architectural. Malfoy arrived at the Gryffindor table with 2 large boys at his back and the practiced confidence of a person who had been told since birth that every room he entered was already his. "Potter," he said, "I hear you've been busy making friends in the Wizengamot." Something in his tone walked the line between admiration and provocation with the precision of someone who had practiced the balance. Harry looked up from his lunch. "Malfoy," he said. Not an invitation, not a dismissal, just an acknowledgement, level and direct. Malfoy sat across from him, which was slightly surprising, and the 2 large boys arranged themselves behind him with the practiced ease of furniture. "My father's been watching the proceedings closely," he said. "He finds them interesting." "I'm sure he does," Harry said. "He'd like to meet you. Properly. He's said so." Harry looked at him. Malfoy was sharp-faced, blond, with eyes that were more intelligent than they usually got credit for in the accounts Harry had read, Malfoy Sr.'s son in more ways than coloring. He was also, Harry thought, genuinely curious about Harry in a way that the performance of nonchalance was only partially concealing. "Tell me why," Harry said. Malfoy blinked. "Why he'd like to meet you. Why he finds it interesting. What he actually thinks about the estate dispute. Not the political calculation, what he actually thinks." Harry looked at him. "You said he finds it interesting. I'm asking what specifically interests him." The 2 large boys looked at each other. This was not, apparently, how these conversations usually went. Malfoy looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that was recalculating something. Then he said, with slightly less performance and slightly more actual opinion, "He thinks Dumbledore's been playing a long game that has now been disrupted. He also thinks you're either genuinely independent or you're someone else's piece on the board, and he wants to know which." "What do you think?" Harry asked. Another blink. What? You. Not your father. What do you think?" Malfoy was quiet for a moment that was longer than he probably intended. "I think," he said carefully, "that nobody who came in here 3 weeks late with a goblin and a ministry filing had anyone's permission to do it. Which is either very brave or very stupid." He paused. "You don't seem stupid." "I'll pass on the meeting with your father," Harry said. "For now. Tell him, if he has something substantive to communicate, Griphook is available as a neutral intermediary. Estate business goes through Gringotts." Malfoy looked at him. "This isn't estate business." "No. But if your father wants a neutral channel, it's available." Harry looked at him steadily. "I'm not interested in playing sides, Malfoy. I'm not Dumbledore's piece and I'm not your father's. If either of them wants something from me, they can say what it is clearly, and we can decide if it's useful." He paused. "As for you, you can sit at whatever table you want. We can talk or not. I don't have a problem with you personally." The 2 large boys were looking at Harry with expressions he couldn't quite read. Malfoy stood up. His expression was doing something complicated. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he said, quietly enough that only Harry could hear it. He wasn't nice to Sirius Black either. "My father. Just so you know." Harry looked up at him. "In 1981. Malfoy said. "When they took him. My father was on the Wizengamot then. He didn't vote for a trial. He didn't, he just let it happen." Something moved in his face, quickly, and then was gone. "I'm not telling you that to confess anything. I'm telling you because you seem like someone who'd want to know all the information." He walked away. Harry watched him go, and then looked down at his lunch, and thought about the specific shape of a person who had been born into a world that made them complicit before they were old enough to consent to it, and was beginning, cautiously, to notice. He found Griphook in the East Wing suite after dinner on the 3rd day, surrounded by documents in a room that now looked exactly like the Gringotts estate management office in miniature, everything arranged with precise logic and the particular smell of goblin ink. Sirius Black's preliminary hearing was today, Harry said. I know. Griphook set down his quill. I had a representative there. Garnet from the London office. He looked at Harry. The hearing lasted 2 hours. The Wiesengemot has ordered a full trial, to be convened within 30 days. Harry sat down in the chair across from the desk. How did he look? He said, and then caught himself. Is that something Garnet would have noted? Griphook reached into his satchel and produced a single page. Garnet's report. She notes that Black is severely malnourished, and showed signs of long-term psychological distress consistent with extended dementor exposure. She also notes. He paused, and this pause was one of the deliberate ones. That he asked, before the hearing ended, whether Harry Potter had sent a letter. Harry was very still. Apparently he received it, Griphook said. He asked whether it was genuine. The panel confirmed that it was. He didn't say anything after that, but the report notes that his demeanor changed. Griphook's expression was precisely unreadable. Garnet wrote, and I quote, "The defendant appeared to remember briefly that there was something to return to." Harry looked at the table for a moment. The trial? He said. 30 days. Yes. What do we need to do? The Gringotts' position is that the estate's interest in the trial is documented and filed. We don't need to do anything further unless you wish to make a personal submission. Griphook looked at him. There is also the matter of Peter Pettigrew. The account anomaly. The Records Department flagged 2 transactions against Pettigrew's sealed account in the last 10 years. Small amounts. The kind of amounts that suggest. Griphook's hands moved briefly over his documents. Not a human accessing a vault. A rat. Harry's hands stilled on the desk. The transactions were from vault maintenance, the kind that happens automatically every few years to keep an account technically active. They're not evidence of anything on their own. Griphook looked at him. But I have flagged the anomaly to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, as required by our banking protocols. Along with a technical note regarding the Animagus register and the specific implications of unregistered animagi with access to financial records. You're brilliant, Harry said. I am thorough, Griphook said, with the air of someone who considered the distinction important. Which, in this case, amounts to the same thing. There was a knock at the door. Harry looked at Griphook. Griphook nodded. Harry called, "Come in." It was McGonagall. She came in with the particular quality of efficiency that suggested she'd been going to do something and had redirected herself to this. She looked at the room with the expression of someone seeing Gringotts operate inside her school and deciding not to comment on it. She looked at Harry. I've had a flu call from Professor Dumbledore, she said. Is he well? Harry asked. A very small pause. He is. He asked me to tell you that the Pettigrew anomaly. He's been informed, apparently, that there may be a development on that front very soon. She looked at him carefully. He wanted you to know before it became public. She paused. As a gesture of good faith. Harry thought about that. It was a good gesture. It meant Dumbledore was cooperating with the proceedings, not just technically, but actually, feeding information rather than managing it. Whether that was because he decided it was right or because he decided it was strategically necessary was, in a sense, irrelevant. The outcome was the same. Tell him thank you, Harry said. Tell him I appreciate it. McGonagall nodded. She turned to go, and then stopped at the door. Mr. Potter. Professor. She turned back slightly, just enough for him to see her face. You handled the first 2 days of class well. Particularly potions. Something in her expression was very careful and very real. Severus is a complicated man with complicated history. But he is an excellent teacher when he chooses to be. I'd suggest, not conceding anything, because there's nothing to concede, but giving him the space to be excellent without making it a battle. Harry thought about this. He was friends with my mother, he said, before they fell out. McGonagall looked at him. How do you know that? The vault documents. There was a letter from her, to my father, before they were together. She mentioned a friend at Hogwarts she'd grown apart from. He paused. She was sad about it. You could tell from the way she wrote. He looked at McGonagall. I think he probably is too, in whatever way he lets himself be. McGonagall was very still for a moment. Get some sleep, Mr. Potter, she said, and her voice was slightly different from its usual precise authority, warmer, less managed. You've had a busy few weeks. Good night, Professor. She left. Harry sat in the East Wing suite with Griphook for another hour, going through the hearing details and the Pettigrew anomaly and the timeline for the trial, and then walked back through the castle's evening corridors toward Gryffindor Tower. Hogwarts at night was a different animal. The staircases moved in the dark with the deliberate unhurriedness of things that had been doing this for centuries and found it more interesting after most of the humans went to sleep. Torches burned low and the portraits talked softly to each other in their frames, and a ghost Harry didn't recognize drifted through a wall and said, mournfully, that the castle was cold tonight. Is it? Harry said. The ghost blinked. Ghosts were apparently not used to being answered. Yes, it said cautiously. Rather. It's the dungeons. The temperature gets into the stones. I'm sorry, Harry said. That sounds uncomfortable. The ghost looked at him with an expression of such genuine surprise that Harry almost smiled. Yes. It is somewhat. A pause. You're the Potter boy. Harry said. The castle knows you're here, the ghost said, and it sounded serious. Old buildings like this, they know who comes into them. The magic in the stones. It drifted backwards slightly. She's been waiting for you, I think. For a long time. Harry looked at the walls. The stone was dark and old, and the torchlight ran across it in patterns that might have been random, or might not have been. He put one hand flat against the nearest wall, the same gesture he'd made at Vault 412, and held it there for a moment. Nothing dramatic happened. But there was something, a warmth, or the suggestion of it. Like pressing your palm to the side of something sleeping. Hello? He said quietly. He walked the rest of the way to Gryffindor Tower with both hands in his pockets, and the sense of something wide and old and patient settling around his shoulders like a coat that fit. Friday afternoon brought flying. Madame Hooch lined them up across from their broomsticks on the Quidditch pitch with the precise authority of a woman who had been teaching children to fly for 30 years and had seen every possible thing go wrong. She walked the line with a quick eye, adjusted stances, corrected grips, and arrived at Harry with a look that was professional and slightly curious. Potter, you've had no prior flying instruction, like the others. I want your hand out, broom up, and we see what happens. He put his hand out. He looked at the broom, an old-school model, its twigs slightly uneven, and said quietly up. The broom came up like it had been waiting. Not slowly, not tentatively. It shot up and slapped his palm with the eagerness of a thing that recognized something, and Harry wrapped his fingers around it, and felt, immediately, absolutely, with the certainty of a lock and a key, that this was a thing he was made for. He didn't know how he knew it. He just did. Madame Hooch looked at the broom in his hand. She looked at him. Instinctive hold, she said, almost to herself. Naturally correct position. She looked at him more carefully. Your father was the best natural flyer I ever taught in 30 years of instruction. Was he? Harry said. Don't let it go to your head, she said, but something in her voice was soft. Mount up. He mounted up. And when he pushed off, the ground fell away under him like it had been meaning to do that for years, and the sky opened up, and the lake caught the afternoon light far below, and the castle spread its towers out on either side, and Harry Potter flew for the first time and understood why his father had been so hard to keep on the ground. Neville, across the pitch, lost control of his broom and shot upward and came down badly, landing with a crack that made everyone flinch. Harry descended before Madame Hooch reached him, was on the ground and beside Neville 30 seconds after the fall, and helped him sit up carefully. Wrist? He asked. Wrist, Neville confirmed, pale and shaken. I'll take him to the hospital wing, Harry said to Madame Hooch. He shouldn't walk alone. She looked between them. Then she nodded. Class dismissed for today. Everyone else brooms away. Harry got Neville up carefully, and they walked back toward the castle. Neville was silent for a moment, then said, in a slightly wobbly voice, You didn't have to. Yes, I did, Harry said simply. Come on. Behind them, he could hear the low hum of 30 students talking about the day's class, and above it all the clean high wind off the mountains, and somewhere in that wind the feeling of the sky, still available, still waiting, patient and vast and entirely unhurried. He had time, he thought. He had school and history and a trial and a godfather, and all of it waiting in sequence like a very full folder. He had time. Chapter 5. What Lies in the Deep Vaults. November arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, overnight, without apology, trading October's amber for something colder and grayer that got into the stones and stayed there. The lake went dark. The mountains went white at the peaks. The corridors smelled of wet wool and candle smoke and the particular indoor warmth of a castle that had been heating itself for 1,000 years and knew exactly how. Harry had settled into Hogwarts the way water settles into a landscape, finding the shape of it, moving into the available spaces, becoming part of the geography without announcing it. He knew which staircases moved at what times. He knew that the third-floor corridor's locked door could be bypassed entirely by a portrait passage 2 turns left of the east wing that let you out near the library, which was more useful than whatever was behind the locked door anyway. He knew that the astronomy tower was coldest just before dawn and most beautiful about 30 seconds after, and he'd been there 4 times in the 5 weeks since arriving, once with Hermione who'd brought a star chart, and once alone. He also knew, by the middle of November, that something was living under Quirrell's turban. It had taken him 3 weeks of careful observation to be certain. The stutter, the inconsistencies, the way certain words produced that flash of steadiness, those had been the first clues, and he'd sat with them for a while before adding in the others. The garlic smell, which was excessive even for someone who believed it had protective properties. The way Quirrell never turned his back fully to the class. The direction he walked to after lessons, not toward the staff room, not toward his quarters, but south, always south, toward the part of the castle that sat above the third-floor corridor. Harry had mentioned none of this to anyone except Grip Hook, who had responded with characteristic pragmatism and added it to a document he was maintaining under the heading Security Observations, Hogwarts Term 1. He had not gone to Dumbledore. This was a decision he made consciously and revisited twice and come back to the same conclusion each time. Dumbledore knew. He had to know. The man had been running this school for 30 years and had placed an obstacle course around a national security artifact and was waiting, Harry was increasingly certain, to see what developed. Which meant Dumbledore had a plan, and the plan required certain things to happen in a certain way. And Harry's job in that plan was apparently to stumble into it at the right moment and be useful. Harry had some thoughts about that. But first, November had other things in it, and they were not all problems. The first good thing was serious. The trial had been set. 40 days from the preliminary hearing, convened in the full Wizengamot chamber on a Wednesday in late November, and the Gringotts legal team had submitted their estate documentation and Remus Lupin had submitted a written witness statement from somewhere that wasn't quite a fixed address, and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had submitted, with the particular reluctance of an institution acknowledging that it had made a significant error, their own findings regarding the anomaly in Peter Pettigrew's sealed account. The account was still active. The transactions were small and consistent with an animagus and rat form accessing the vault through standard maintenance protocols. The animagus registers showed Pettigrew as registered, untrained, theoretical only, but the Hogwarts records, subpoenaed by the Wizengamot and produced by McGonagall with the expression of a woman who had known exactly where they were for 30 years, showed something different. Pettigrew had been awarded his practical transfiguration OWL with a score that should have been impossible for someone without sustained animagus practice. The DMLE had issued a wanted notice for Peter Pettigrew. Living status, unknown but probable. Harry had heard this from Griphook on a Monday afternoon, and had sat with it for a while. Then he'd gone to Transfiguration and made a particularly good attempt at turning his matchstick into a needle, and McGonagall had put a gold star on his paper, and he'd thought, one thing at a time. The second good thing was Hermione. She'd come to find him in the library on the second week after his arrival, which had surprised him because she had a system, and the system didn't usually include seeking people out. People found her, if they were in the library, and she either helped them or didn't based on her assessment of whether they were serious. She came to his table with a piece of parchment covered in neat writing and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about the Provision 7 petition." "What about it?" Harry said. "The precedent it sets." She sat down, which was apparently something she decided to do while walking over, because she didn't hesitate. "I've been reading Gringotts case law. I got access to the restricted section records through the library archive, which technically requires a teacher's signature, but Madame Pants has a discretionary clause for research purposes, and I was very specific about the research purpose, Hermione." "Right. The precedent. If the Charter allows a Provision 7 petition by any orphaned heir of significant standing, it's never actually been tested for what significant standing means. The interpretation has always defaulted to financial significance, vault holdings above a certain threshold." She put the parchment on the table between them. "But the original Charter language says standing, not financial standing. Which is broader?" Harry looked at the parchment. She'd pulled the original Charter text and annotated it in 3 different colors. He picked it up. "There are at least 4 other families," she said, "where children were placed in circumstances that seem inconsistent with the will's specifications, in the same period. Post-Voldemort, same window. I found 3 of them in public court records and 1 in a prophet archive." She looked at him. "I'm not saying what you did was wrong. I'm saying it might have been the first time the door was opened, and there might be other people who should be able to walk through it." Harry looked at the parchment for a long moment. He thought about Neville Longbottom growing up with a grandmother who loved him but also scared him. He thought about the locked-away histories of a war he'd been born into and survived and then had sealed around him like a second prison. "Can I keep this?" he said about the parchment. "I made you a copy," she said, and produced an identical sheet from her bag. "I have the original." Harry looked at her. "Have you always been like this?" "Like what?" "Like this." He gestured at the research and the copies and the 3-color annotation system. She looked at him with the careful expression of someone deciding whether to be pleased or defensive. "Yes," she said. "Mostly people find it annoying. I find it useful," he said. "Which is different." She looked at him for another moment. Then she opened her bag and took out a book. "I'm going to keep working. You can work too if you want." "I don't mind." They worked in parallel for 2 hours in the library, and it was, Harry thought, the most comfortable he'd felt in a room with another person who wasn't Hagrid. The troll happened on Halloween. In retrospect, Harry thought, it was almost funny. The one night he hadn't brought the folder of things to worry about because he'd decided to take one evening off and sit in the Great Hall and eat sweets and watch the enchanted ceiling do its thing. The candles had been carved into jack-o'-lanterns and the ceiling was doing a very convincing thunderstorm, and someone had transfigured the dessert display into skeletons that moved when you took a piece. And Harry had been 3 bites into a very good chocolate tart when Professor Quirrell burst through the doors. He burst in with his hands up and his eyes wild and said, in a voice that contained absolutely no stutter at all, "Troll! Troll in the dungeon!" He paused for exactly 1 dramatic beat. "Thought you ought to know." Then he fainted. The great hall erupted. Students stood, shouted, moved in several directions at once while the professors converged at the front with wand drawn, and in the chaos Dumbledore's voice rose above everything calling for calm, for houses to proceed to their dormitories immediately, for prefects to take charge. Harry sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, processing several things simultaneously. The troll was in the dungeon. That was where the Slytherin dormitories were. It was also on a different route, not far from a different destination for something that didn't have to go where trolls usually went if someone had, for instance, directed it somewhere specific. Quirrell had been in the dungeon area recently. Harry had tracked his movements for 3 weeks, and Quirrell spent more time south and below than he spent anywhere else. And Hermione, who left the hall early every evening because she ate quickly and liked to get back to the library before it closed, he stood up and moved against the crowd of students heading for the staircases, which immediately put him in conflict with the flow of traffic and a prefect named Percy Weasley, who was Ron's brother and had the full-bodied conviction of a person who believed in procedure. "Potter, you need to go to the—" "Which way did Hermione go?" Harry said. Percy stopped. What?" "Hermione Granger. She's not in the Great Hall. She left early." "Which way?" Percy's expression went through a fast sequence of emotions. I saw her near the second-floor bathroom. She seemed upset about something." He stopped, as the implication caught up with him. Oh no. Harry was already moving. He went against the stream of students, taking shortcuts through the portrait passages that 3 weeks of castle geography had taught him, and came out near the second-floor corridor 3 minutes ahead of where the crowd would have taken him. He could smell it before he heard it, a damp, earthy, overwhelming smell like something that lived underground and had never been properly washed. The bathroom door was off one hinge. He pushed through it. The troll was enormous. Not hypothetically enormous, not textbook enormous, actually, physically, room-filling enormous, with fists like boulders and legs like tree trunks and a face that contained only the bare minimum of cognition required for finding things and hitting them. It had found the bathroom and was in the process of hitting it, methodically, with a club the size of a small car. Hermione was backed against the far wall between 2 sinks, white-faced, frozen in the particular paralysis of someone whose brain was trying to process a situation it had no framework for. Harry walked into the room. The troll noticed him. Its small eyes moved slowly from the damage it was doing to this new, smaller thing that had arrived. It made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a statement of intention. Harry had his wand out. He'd had it out since the portrait passage, because he thought about tactics first and bravery second, which his father's letters had suggested was something his mother had drilled into the marauders with varying success. "Hermione," he said, his voice even. "Move left. Now, steadily." She moved. Because Harry's voice in that moment had the quality of something that knew exactly what it was doing, and Hermione Granger, who valued competence above almost everything, responded to it automatically. The troll swung its club. Harry cast Wingardium Leviosa, and the club came out of the troll's grip and rose to the ceiling. The troll looked at the ceiling with the affronted expression of something that had never had an object removed from its possession before. While it was looking up, Harry cast Locomotor Mortis at its legs. The troll sat down. Heavily. The bathroom floor cracked. It was not technically unconscious. But it was sitting on the floor looking at its own legs with profound confusion, which was functionally similar for the purpose of getting out of the room. "Come on," Harry said to Hermione. She walked to him. She was still pale, but she was walking and her eyes were clear. She looked at the sitting troll and then at Harry and then at the wand in his hand. You used 2 spells simultaneously. Sequentially," he said. "Very fast. The sequence was less than a second. Come on," he said again. They came out into the corridor and into a situation, McGonagall, Snape, and Quirrell arriving from different directions at approximately the same moment, drawn by the noise or by the detection charms or by the general principle that adults eventually arrived at disaster sites. McGonagall's face went through a sequence of emotions that ended at a controlled expression that meant she was saving the larger reaction for a more appropriate moment. Snape looked at Harry. Then at Hermione. Then at the bathroom door. Quirrell looked at the bathroom door. He looked at Harry. For just a fraction of a second, the same flash Harry had been cataloging for weeks, those eyes were completely steady. Then the nervousness came back. "And Merlin," he said. Has something happened?" "Troll," Harry said. "It's sitting down in there. You'll want to send it back before it tries to stand up again." McGonagall looked at Quirrell. "Quirinus." Quirrell went into the bathroom with his wand drawn, and the troll went out again shortly afterward by magical means Harry didn't fully see, which he noted without comment. McGonagall turned to them. "Miss Granger, are you hurt?" "No," Hermione said. No. Mr. Potter. Would you care to explain why you are on the second floor rather than in Gryffindor Tower with the rest of your house?" "I knew Hermione wasn't in the Great Hall," Harry said. "I worked out roughly where she'd be. I came to check." McGonagall looked at him. Then at Hermione. Then back at Harry, in a sequence that was doing the same calculation Augusta Longbottom had done at the Wizengamot. "You neutralized a fully grown mountain troll. It's sitting on the floor," Harry said. "I didn't knock it out. You neutralized it," she said again, with a finality that meant we are going to discuss this, but later and in more detail. 5 points to Gryffindor, for quick thinking. She looked at both of them. "Detention would be more appropriate, but I find myself unable to assign it under the circumstances." She straightened her robes. "Go to your dormitory. Both of you." "Professor," Harry said before she could turn away. She stopped. "The troll was in the dungeon," he said. "Not the second floor. Trolls don't navigate independently. Someone directed it here." The corridor was very still. Snape, who had been silent through the entire exchange, looked at Harry with an expression that was new, not the cool assessment of the first potions lesson, not the careful hostility of someone defending territory, but something more intent and less comfortable, the look of a person whose own private calculation had just been interrupted by someone else arriving at the same result. "That," Snape said quietly, "is a serious accusation." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not accusing anyone specifically. I'm noting that someone directed the troll, and that means someone knew where the troll was going to be, which means someone knew about the troll in advance." He looked at Snape steadily. "I thought it was worth saying out loud." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "Indeed," he said, and it was impossible to tell from his tone what exactly he meant by it. Harry and Hermione walked to Gryffindor Tower. They walked in silence for 2 corridors, and then Hermione said, "You knew, didn't you? About the troll being directed." "I had a theory," Harry said. "About a few things. About Quirrell." He glanced at her. "What do you know about Quirrell?" "The stutter is inconsistent," she said immediately. "It appears most frequently when he's performing for an audience, and rarely when he's genuinely concentrating. I looked up the nervous stutter patterns described in Emotional Magic and Physical Manifestation, which is a third-year text. I read that one too," Harry said. She stopped walking. Looked at him. "You've been watching him. For about 3 weeks. And you haven't told anyone." "I've told Griphook. Not a professor. Not Dumbledore." Harry was quiet for a moment. They'd reached the portrait of the fat lady, who was looking at them with the expression of someone who had overheard interesting things and was pretending not to have. He said the password and they went through. The common room was empty. Everyone still hadn't come back from dormitories or hadn't come down yet. The fire was burning low, and the room had the particular warmth of a place that was used to having people in it, and was keeping itself ready. They sat down near the fire. "Dumbledore knows," Harry said. "About Quirrell, about whatever's in the third-floor corridor, about all of it. He's arranged it. The obstacles around the stone, he designed them to be passable by students, which means he wants someone to get to it, or he wants whoever's trying to steal it to believe they can get to it." He looked at the fire. "I think he's running a trap. I think Quirrell is in it. I think there's something living under Quirrell's turban that is considerably more dangerous than Quirrell." Hermione was very still. "You think it's him?" "I think it's him," Harry agreed. The fire cracked. The castle shifted slightly around them, the way old buildings shifted, redistributing their weight. "What are you going to do?" Hermione asked. "I'm working on it," Harry said. She looked at him. "I want to help." He looked back at her. She was completely serious, not performing courage, not managing anxiety into words, Just genuine and direct and looking at him like someone who had decided. All right, he said. Then let's be smart about it. He found the mirror of Eris on a Tuesday in late November. Not by accident. Nothing Harry did at this point was by accident. He'd been mapping the castle methodically for weeks, partly because it was the kind of thing that interested him and partly because he understood that knowing the geography was knowing the rules, and knowing the rules was knowing where the exceptions were. He'd found the portrait passage to the library early. He'd found the room on the 7th floor that seemed to change its contents depending on what you needed. He'd discovered it while looking for somewhere to practice nonverbal spell work at 2 in the morning, and the room had provided a perfectly equipped practice space, which he'd used 3 times since. He'd found the kitchens and the entrance to the Hufflepuff dormitories and the specific staircase that led to a corridor of disused classrooms that were perfect for the kind of thinking that required walking. The mirror was in one of those classrooms. He'd seen it through the gap in a door that was almost closed, the room beyond it dark except for the strange, sourceless light the mirror threw. He'd opened the door and come in quietly and stood in front of it and looked. And seen his parents. Not as ghosts, not as photographs, not as the descriptions other people had given him, as people, warm and present and looking back at him from the silver surface with expressions that were exactly what he would have expected if he'd been allowed to expect anything. His father's hair going every direction, his mother's eyes the same green as his own. His father's hand on his shoulder. His mother's expression doing the thing Lupin had described, the quiet certainty of someone who had decided she was allowed to be exactly what she was. He stood there for a long time. Not crying. Not because he was suppressing it, because the feeling was too large to come out that way, too foundational. It was the feeling of looking at something you had always been missing without knowing the specific shape of the absence until you saw it filled. He looked at them. He let himself look. He let himself have it. Then, carefully, he turned around and walked out of the room. He didn't go back. Not because the mirror wasn't worth looking at, it was the most powerful thing he'd seen in a castle full of powerful things. But because his father's letter had been in the vault, and his mother's letter had been in Lupin's description of her voice, and Hagrid had given him the photograph album on his birthday with all those moving images of 2 people who were real, who had histories and preferences, and one of them had had difficulty with tact, and the other had been very good at asking the right questions. He had them in the folder. The unlabeled one. He didn't need a mirror that showed him what he most wanted and kept him standing in front of it forever. He needed to finish what he'd started. He went to find Dumbledore that evening. Not because Dumbledore had summoned him, not because someone had sent him, but because it was time. He'd turned it over long enough and the picture was as clear as it was going to get, and standing around waiting for something to happen was not, at this point, something Harry was inclined to do. Dumbledore's office was on the 7th floor, the stone gargoyle with the absurd password that Hermione had discovered by reading a history of Hogwarts, headmasters and cross-referencing sweet names against years of confectionery invention. Harry said sherbet lemon and the gargoyle moved and he went up the spiral staircase and knocked. "Come in, Harry." The office was full of things, instruments and portraits and shelves of objects that hummed or spun or sat very still in the particular way of things that were choosing not to demonstrate themselves. Fawkes was on his perch, a bird of improbable redness, and he looked at Harry with one round golden eye as Harry came through the door and made a sound like someone tuning a very old instrument to perfect pitch. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up and his expression was exactly what Harry had expected, the careful warmth, the watchfulness, the layer of something older and more complicated underneath. He looked at Harry the way he'd been looking at him since the leaky cauldron, with the recalibrated quality of a man who was constantly updating his estimate. "Harry," he said, "I thought you might come." "I found the mirror," Harry said. A pause. "Did you?" "It's in the disused classroom on the 3rd disused corridor, left branch off the main passage." Harry sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. "I looked at it once and I left." He looked at Dumbledore. "I want to talk about the stone." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, The November night was very dark and very cold. Fawkes made another small sound and settled his wings. "The stone," Dumbledore said carefully. "Nicholas Flamel's Philosopher's Stone. Vault 713 moved to Hogwarts in July for safekeeping. Currently behind a sequence of obstacles in the third-floor corridor." Harry looked at him levelly. "Quirrell has been trying to get to it. He's been making runs at the corridor at night. I've tracked his movement patterns for the last 3 weeks. He hasn't gotten through yet, but he will. The obstacles were designed to be passable." "Harry, I'm not criticizing the design," Harry said. "I think I understand what you were trying to do. Someone was going to try to steal the stone, and you wanted them to be able to try, to believe they could succeed, so you could control when and where the confrontation happened." He paused. "But the thing living under Quirrell's turban is Voldemort." The office was very still. "If I'm wrong," Harry said, "tell me. I'll revise my thinking." Dumbledore looked at him. His expression had moved past the careful warmth and past the watchfulness and into something rawer, the expression of a man at the end of a very long game who had not quite expected the other player to walk into his study and describe the board. "You are not wrong," Dumbledore said quietly. "Okay," Harry said. "Then here's what I want to know." He leaned forward slightly. "What happens when Quirrell gets to the stone? Because the obstacles are passable, and Voldemort is not stupid, and eventually the attempt will succeed unless something stops it. What is the plan for that moment?" A pause. "I had intended to ensure that I was available to intervene at the necessary, but you won't be," Harry said. "Not aggressively, just factually. The attempt is going to come at a moment you're not expecting. That's how traps work from the other side. Voldemort knows this castle, he was a student here, and Quirrell has had months to plan it. The moment will be chosen specifically to exclude you." He looked at Dumbledore. "The backup plan. What is it?" "Harry," Dumbledore said, "the intent was never to involve students in. I'm not talking about involving students." Harry held his gaze. "I'm asking what the backup plan is, specifically, because I have been in this castle for 5 weeks and I have identified a man possessed by the most dangerous dark wizard in a century and the man's plan for retrieving a nationally significant magical artifact. And I haven't told anyone official because every time I think about who the official person is, I end up back at you, and Professor." He stopped. He looked at Dumbledore carefully. "I'm not trying to replace your plan. I'm trying to understand it well enough to help if it fails. That's all." Dumbledore looked at him. He looked at Harry for what felt like a very long time, the real look, the one that wasn't performing warmth or managing an impression, the one that was just this specific old man at this specific moment seeing this specific 11-year-old boy who had, over the course of 3 months, done things that no 11-year-old in his memory had done. And not out of destiny or prophecy but out of the very straightforward conviction that questions deserved answers and problems deserved attention. "The mirror," Dumbledore said finally. "The mirror of Erised has been modified. It no longer simply shows desire, it now functions as a guardian mechanism. The stone is hidden within it. To retrieve the stone, a person must be able to look into the mirror and see it without desiring to use it." He paused. "Someone who desired to use it, to use the power it offered, would see only themselves with the stone, and would never actually retrieve it. Only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could take it from the mirror." Harry thought about this. He thought about what he'd seen in the mirror, not the stone, not power, his parents. He thought about what Voldemort, reduced to a shadow living under a man's turban, would see when he looked into a mirror that showed desire. He'd see himself, Harry said. Restored. Alive. He'd reach for it, and it would stay out of reach. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That is the mechanism. It's clever," Harry said honestly. "But if Quirrell is the one who looks in the mirror, it doesn't work the same way. Quirrell might want the stone for reasons that don't involve using it himself. He might want it to give to Voldemort, which is a different kind of desire than wanting to use it personally." He looked at Dumbledore. "Has the mechanism been tested against that scenario?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Dumbledore said nothing. Right, Harry said. It hasn't. He sat back in the chair. He thought. Fawkes watched him think with the patient golden attention of something that had existed long enough to find thinking admirable. I need to be able to go into that room, Harry said. Not now. Not tonight. But when the attempt comes, and it's coming, I can feel the timeline on it. I need to be there. Not as bait, not as a variable in someone else's plan. Because if the mechanism fails, there needs to be someone in that room who can respond to what's actually there. Dumbledore was quiet. I'm not asking permission, Harry said, and his voice was very clear and very calm. I'm asking for information. What obstacles are there and how do they work? Because I'm going to learn them regardless. I've been mapping this castle for 5 weeks. But it would be more efficient if you told me. The fire crackled. Fawkes made the tuning instrument sound again, softer this time. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. Then he did something Harry had not expected. He reached into his desk and produced a folded piece of parchment, and set it on the desk between them. Devil's snare, he said. Requires warmth or light. Any light-producing charm will do. A logic puzzle involving potions, which will require analytical thinking. A chess game, magical, self-directing pieces, requiring genuine tactical skill. A key challenge, flying keys, requiring a broomstick and quick hands. And the mirror. He paused. There was a troll, but the Halloween incident has complicated that particular obstacle's reliability. Harry picked up the parchment. He read it. He folded it and put it in his robe pocket. Thank you, he said. Harry. Dumbledore's voice was different now. Not the headmaster, not the chess player. Something more personal. I want to explain some things to you. About the decisions I made. About why I know why, Harry said. He looked at him. You believed you were the only one with the whole picture. You believed that if you gave people information, they'd either not understand it or they'd use it badly, and the plan, your plan, would fail. He paused. And you weren't entirely wrong about that. Most of the time. He looked at him steadily. You were wrong about me. But I think that's because you didn't know me. And I didn't know myself yet either, not properly, not until this September. He stood up. I'm not asking you to give me the whole picture all at once. I'm asking for the parts one need, when I need them, because we're on the same side and pretending otherwise wastes both our time. Dumbledore looked up at him from the chair, the strange reversal of the old man sitting and the child standing, and his expression was something Harry hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than surprise. Remarkably like Lily, he said quietly. The way she thought. People keep saying that, Harry said. I'm starting to think I should take it as a methodology. He moved toward the door. I'll let you know if Quirrell's timeline shifts. You do the same. Harry. He stopped at the door. I am sorry, Dumbledore said, for the things that were done wrong. I am genuinely, deeply sorry. Harry held the door handle. He thought about the cupboard. He thought about the letter in the vault, the one with no reply. He thought about a man who had genuinely believed he was doing right and had been genuinely wrong and was genuinely trying, now, to do better. I know, he said. Keep doing better. That's what matters. He went back down the spiral staircase into the castle's nighttime quiet, and Hogwarts moved around him, stairs shifting, torches flickering, the portraits watching with the attention of things that had been here long enough to know when something significant was happening. The Pettigrew development came the following Friday. Not a small development. Not a gradual one. The kind of development that arrived in the Prophet like a stone through a window, front page, above the fold, in the specific typeface the Prophet reserved for things that were going to require multiple follow-up articles. Convicted traitor Pettigrew found alive. Gringotts account anomaly leads to discovery in West Country. The audit team had apparently tracked the account activity to a property in Devon, a farm, of all things, where a large and extremely unhappy rat had been living in the kitchen for several years in the company of a Muggle couple who had no idea who or what their rat was. The rat, when confronted with truth serum administered by the audit team and then with a reversal charm for the animagus form, had become Peter Pettigrew, who had then done what Peter Pettigrew apparently did best, which was confirm everything the Wizengamot had been building a case toward, completely accidentally, in the middle of trying to lie his way out of it. Harry read the article 4 times. Then he set it down and sat at the Gryffindor breakfast table and ate a piece of toast and did not allow himself to react beyond what was appropriate for a public setting, which was a small, controlled exhale and a very steady grip on his tea. Ron had read it over his shoulder. He set the paper down and looked at Harry with an expression that was honest in the way Ron's expressions were always honest. He hadn't learned to manage them yet, and Harry thought he hoped he never would. "Blimey," he said softly. "Yeah," Harry said. "So Sirius Black really is. The trial is in 5 days." Harry looked at him. "We'll know properly after the trial." "Harry." Ron's voice was careful. Are you all right?" Harry thought about the question seriously, which Ron had not necessarily expected, because Ron's "are you all right" usually expected a "yeah, fine" in return, and Ron was already slightly surprised. Harry thought about whether he was all right and decided that yes, mostly, with the qualification that all right had a wider range than it had had in September, and that things sitting in the range required more maintenance than they used to. "Getting there," he said. Ron nodded. He picked up his own toast. "Good," he said. "That's yeah? Good." Hermione arrived with the prophet already folded open, sat down, and looked between them with the expression of someone who has calculated the emotional temperature and chosen not to disrupt it. She poured herself tea. They ate breakfast in the November morning light, and the castle held them in its warmth, and outside the mountains were white, and the lake was dark, and the sky over Scotland was enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful. Neville came in late, sat down, reached for the bread rolls without hesitation. He'd stopped hesitating on the bread rolls about 3 weeks ago, and said, "Did anyone do the herbology essay yet? I got stuck on the bit about mandrake restorative properties." "I did it last night," Hermione said. "I'll walk you through the section after dinner." "I got stuck there too," Ron said. "Can I come?" "Obviously," Hermione said with the air of someone who was annoyed but not actually annoyed, which Harry thought was probably as close to warm as Hermione defaulted to before she'd known you for a while. He reached for the marmalade and thought about the trial in 5 days and the obstacle course under the school and the living dark thing wrapped around an anxious man's head, and all the things he'd put in the folder marked "deal with later" that were very nearly later. One thing at a time. He put marmalade on his toast. He went back to the Quidditch pitch at dusk that Friday, which he did when he needed to think without thinking. Something about the altitude and the cold air and the way the broom handled the wind made the background noise of his brain go quiet in a way that nothing else did. He flew until the last light went from the sky and the pitch was lit only by the castle's windows and the pale ghost of the moon coming up over the eastern mountains. He flew hard, not practicing, just flying, the broom moving with him the way something moved when it was natural, when it wasn't effort but simply the shape of a thing being what it was. He came down when he couldn't see properly anymore and walked back to the castle with the broom over his shoulder, and the cold in his face, and something clearer in him than it had been when he'd gone out. McGonagall was waiting at the entrance. "You should have a warming charm on your robes," she said, instead of asking why he'd been flying in the dark. "I know. I forgot." She cast it herself, briskly, without fanfare. Then she looked at him with the careful expression she'd had since Halloween, the expression that had been recalibrating regularly, and had arrived somewhere that wasn't quite worry and wasn't quite professional assessment, and was something more personal than either. "The trial," she said. "Wednesday." "Wednesday," he agreed. "Gringotts has arranged for you to attend. Griphook filed the request this afternoon." Harry looked at her. "He didn't tell me. He wanted it to be confirmed first." She looked at him directly. "Will you be all right?" "Whatever the outcome, I'll be all right," Harry said. whatever the outcome. He meant it. I know what I went there to do. I went to find out the truth and make sure it got dealt with properly. Whatever the truth turns out to be. He paused. I can work with the truth. It's the not knowing that's hard. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face, the same thing that had moved in it when he talked about Snape and his mother in the East Wing, the same private response she kept almost visible and then tucked away. Your mother said something very similar to me once, she said. In her 7th year. I had told her that she should prepare herself for a difficult examination result, and she said. She stopped. She said, I'd rather know it's bad and work with it than not know and keep hoping badly. Harry looked at her. She was right. McGonagall said. She was usually right. She stepped back toward the door. Come inside, Potter. It's November. He followed her in. The castle settled around him as he walked through the entrance hall, past the staircases and the portraits, and the warm ember light of the torches, toward the Gryffindor Tower and the sound of the common room above. The trial was in 5 days. Pettigrew was caught. Quirrell was running out of time on whatever timeline he'd set for himself. The mirror was waiting in the dark classroom. And Harry Potter, who had spent his whole life in a cupboard under a staircase, was walking through a 1,000-year-old castle that the Sorting Hat had said was his, going over tomorrow's potions notes in his head, and thinking that things were, mostly, moving in the right direction. Mostly. He went upstairs.